The horses are already awake. They stand at the edge of the sky in the dark, before dawn. 4 of them, white, the way fire is white, and they do not stamp or pull the way mortal horses do. They wait. They have always waited. That is what they were made for. The man who comes to take the reins does not hurry. He walks the way someone walks when the body knows the path before the mind decides to take it. His cloak is the color the sky goes in the last few minutes before the first light touches it. That particular shade that is not quite black and not quite blue. The color that exists for only a moment each morning and then is gone. He takes the reins. He looks down. Below him, the world is still sleeping. Cities and rivers and mountains and the long reach of the sea. Temples with his name above the doors. Forests where people he once loved were changed into things that could not love him back. Battlefields where the grass grew back over ground that was once soaked in blood he helped to spill. All of it quiet. All of it waiting for the light. Later ages would place him here, at the reins of the sun. And the image stuck the way certain images stick because they are right in the way that symbols are right even when they simplify. Whether the daily crossing belonged to him or to the older sun god the Greeks called Helios, the light became Apollo's in the imagination of everyone who came after. And so, here he is. Here he has always been. At the Rhines. Before dawn. Looking down. He has done this every morning for longer than memory reaches. He will do it again tomorrow. This is the story of everything that happened in between. A god who carried light across the sky and could not figure out how to carry the things he lost along the way. A god of truth who kept running into things he did not understand about himself. A god of music who heard the world clearly and still could not make it come out right. He was the god of light, and this is the dark that came with it. There is a kind of exhaustion that goes deeper than the body. The body can be rested. You lie down. You close your eyes. You wake up, and the weight is lighter. But there is another kind. The kind that lives in the chest and the throat and the backs of the eyes. And that kind does not respond to sleep. It simply stays. Leto knew that kind. She had been walking for a long time, not walking the way travelers walk, with a destination fixed in the mind and the miles falling away beneath purposeful feet. Walking the way someone walks when there is nowhere to go but forward. Because standing still is worse, and turning back is impossible, and forward is the only direction that feels like anything at all. She was going to have a child. 2 children. Actually, she could feel them. The weight and the warmth of them. And even in the exhaustion, there was something that was not quite happiness, but lived in the same neighborhood. She held on to that. The problem was Hera, queen of Olympus, wife of Zeus, who had not chosen to be humiliated, but had been humiliated anyway. Because that is what happens when you marry someone who loves the whole world more than he loves you. Leto had not started this. That was the thing she came back to. On the long cold nights when the wind came off the water, and there was no shelter, and her feet had gone past hurting into something else. She had not asked for any of it. But here she was. Hera had sent word through the world. No land was to receive Leto. No island. No shore. No piece of ground attached to the earth was to let her rest. If they did, Hera's anger would fall on them. So the doors closed. On by on. The way doors close in a dream, where you reach for each handle and find it locked before you even turn it. Leto had gone to the islands of the Aegean, the places where the water is so clear you can see the sand on the bottom, 30 feet down. She had gone to the rocky northern shores where the wind comes hard off the mountains. She had asked. She had been told no. The world is large when you are welcome in it. The world is very small when you are not. She was tired, in a way that the word tired does not cover. She carried 2 lives inside her, and she could not find a single place to put them down safely. And the sea went on in every direction, beautiful and cold and completely indifferent to what she needed. On one of those nights, somewhere between one dark coast and another, she sat at the edge of a boat, going nowhere in particular, and put her face in her hands. She did not cry. She was past crying. She just sat there. The sea moved under her. There was a small island she had passed before without stopping. A low, flat piece of rock and scrub grass that barely lifted itself above the water. The kind that does not appear on important maps because there is nothing on it worth marking. It was called Delos. It was not attached to the seabed the way other islands are. It floated. Technically, drifting so slowly you would not notice unless you were watching over a very long time. It was not under Hera's decree, because it was not, strictly speaking, land. Leto found it again. She stepped onto the pale shore. The ground held. She put her hands on a small palm tree, the only tree on the island, and she leaned against it and breathed. And for the first time in longer than she could measure, nothing told her to leave. She stayed. She held the tree. She waited for morning. The god of light was not born into brightness. He was born at the end of a very long darkness that his mother walked through alone. Because some doors only open if you are willing to keep knocking long after any reasonable person would have stopped. She kept knocking. That is where he comes from. That is the first thing you need to know about him. The palm tree was small. That is the detail that stays with you. When you think about the birth of one of the most powerful gods in the Greek imagination, not a mountain, not a golden hall with columns and light pouring in from every direction, a small palm tree on a flat island that technically should not have existed, on a morning that smelled like salt water and cold air coming off the Aegean. Leto held the tree. She had been holding it for a long time by then, through the kind of hours that do not move the way normal hours move, that stretch and contract in ways that have nothing to do with the actual position of the sun. Her sister Asteria was there. A goddess named Eileithyia had finally come, after a long delay that had Hera's fingerprints all over it, to help with the birth. The other goddesses who had gathered on the island sent Iris, the rainbow, across the sky to find Eileithyia and bring her. It had taken time. Everything in this story takes time at the worst possible moments. But Eileithyia came, and when she came, things began. Artemis arrived first. She came into the world quietly, which would turn out to be characteristic. No excessive drama, no announcement. She was simply there, and then she was helping, turning almost immediately to assist with the birth of her brother, as if she had understood her role before she had even fully arrived. She was minutes old and already doing the work. That, too, would turn out to be characteristic. Then Apollo, the accounts say that when he was born, the island shook, not violently, not the way the earth shakes when something is breaking, the way the earth moves when something that has been waiting finally settles into what it was always going to be. A long, slow recognition. The swans that circled the island called out. The water around Delos changed color, just briefly. Gold, coming up through the blue the way light comes up through water when something moves underneath it. The palm tree bloomed. Delos stopped moving. That is the part the old stories make sure to mention, because it matters. Delos had been a floating island for as long as anyone knew, drifting through the Aegean without anchor or destination, belonging to no particular sea and no particular sky. When Apollo was born on it, it stopped, it put down roots, and it stayed where it was, and it never moved again. Leto let go of the tree. She looked at her two children. The girl who had arrived first and already seemed to understand what she was for. The boy who had brought the island to a standstill simply by arriving. She must have felt something in that moment that was larger than anything this story has words for. She had walked across the water for what felt like the whole length of her life. She had been turned away from every shore. She had sat in a boat in the dark with her face in her hands and found, somehow, the thing that was not quite hope, but kept her moving forward, anyway. And now here she was, on a small flat island, with one palm tree and two newborn gods. And the world had just rearranged itself slightly to make room for what she had brought into it. The swans kept circling, the water was still gold, and the island, for the first time in its long floating existence, stayed exactly where it was. Here is what that means. If you let yourself think about it, Apollo spent his entire existence trying to bring order to things. He built the most organized oracle in the ancient world. He set the rhythms of music. He established the rules of prophecy. He built temples and sanctuaries along lines that people are still studying. Every single thing he did moved in the direction of making the chaotic into something that held still long enough to be understood. That impulse did not come from nowhere. It came from a floating island. It came from a mother who had no ground to stand on. It came from the fact that the first solid thing in his entire existence was an island that stopped moving the moment he arrived. As if the world had been waiting for something to organize itself around, and had finally found it. He spent the rest of his life doing for the world what the world had done for him on that first morning. Whether that made him happy is a different question. It is, in fact, the question, but that comes later. For now there is just the island and the salt air, and the two children, and the tree, and the swans, making their long circles over the water, and a mother who had walked a very long way to get here, and was estate for this one morning, exactly where she needed to be. The light came up over the Aegean. The island held its ground. That was enough for one morning. That was more than enough. There is a question the old stories almost never ask, because they are so busy with what the gods do that they forget to wonder what the gods are to each other. What is it like to have a twin who is the opposite of everything you are, and to love them completely anyway? Artemis went into the forests. Apollo went into the temples. She chose the wild places, the unmapped edges of the world, where the trees grow close together and the light comes through in pieces, and the only sounds are the ones the animals make when no one is watching. She wanted no cities. She wanted no ceremonies. She wanted the clean, cold air of high places and the company of her hunting companions, and the freedom that comes from owing nothing to the complicated social world that human beings and gods alike spend so much energy maintaining. He chose the center. He chose the places where people gathered, where the questions were loudest and the need for answers most acute. He chose music and prophecy, and the long, difficult work of being the thing that a civilization organizes itself around. He chose to be known. He chose to be needed. He built his temples at the centers of things and sat at the heart of them, and let the world come to him. Two children from the same mother, born on the same island, within hours of each other, going in exactly opposite directions. And yet, they both carried bows. That is the detail worth pausing on. Out of everything they could have been. Out of all the weapons and instruments and symbols that the Greeks used to tell the gods apart. Both Apollo and Artemis chose the bow. Both of them fought from a distance. Neither of them was a close-quarters fighter, the way Ares was, built for the terrible intimacy of combat, where you can see the other person's face. They stood back. They took aim. They released, from far away, and they never missed. The bow is a strange weapon for a god of light and a god of the hunt to share. It requires patience. It requires the ability to hold very still while you calculate exactly where something is going, and then to let go cleanly, without flinching, and trust that what you have set in motion will arrive where you intended. Both of them were good at that. Both of them were, in their different ways, gods of things that happen from a distance. Apollo sent his music out into the world and let it do what it would. He sent his prophecies out through the Pythia and let the humans interpret them. He shot his arrows of plague across the sky without coming down into the camps and doing the work by hand. even his light. The great defining thing about him was something that reached, something that crossed the distance between the sun and the world below and arrived changed by the journey. Softer, spread out, distributed among everything it touched. He was never quite in the room with you. He was always arriving from somewhere else. Artemis was the same way. In her own manner, she moved through her forests, unseen by most of the people who walked through those same forests. She protected the wild things by staying ahead of the threat, watching from the tree line. The hunters who dedicated themselves to her knew her through the quality of the hunt, through the clean shot and the right moment, and the sense of something guiding the arrow that was larger than their own skill. She was there in the way that wildness is there, present but not visible. They understood each other in the way that people understand each other when they have been through the same thing and arrived at different conclusions. The same origin, the same mother, the same dark water, the same small island that stopped moving when they arrived. And then two completely different answers to the question of what to do next. She chose independence. He chose connection. Neither of them was wrong. What is worth noticing is what each choice cost them. Artemis chose independence, and it gave her everything she asked for and nothing she did not. She moved through a world entirely on her terms. She was never betrayed by someone she loved because she loved differently than he did. More carefully, more selectively, in ways that built walls before they built doors. Her story is not a sad one, but it is a solitary one. Apollo chose connection, and it gave him music and prophecy and temples and the love of a civilization. It also gave him loss after loss after loss, because connection is like that. You open yourself to it, and the opening lets in everything, including the things you were not ready for. He knew that. Eventually. He may have known it from the beginning. He chose it anyway, on the island, before either of them was old enough to have made any choices at all. They lay side by side on the ground that had finally stopped moving, and the world was simple in the way that the world is only simple right at the beginning, before you have gone out into it and discovered what it costs. The swans were still there, somewhere above the water. The tree threw its small shadow across the pale ground. She would go left. He would go right, and they would carry the same weapon and walk in opposite directions, and the world would be larger and stranger for both of them because of it. Some things between twins do not require explanation. Some things simply are the way they are, and the love that holds them together does not need to understand itself to be real. She went into the forests. He went into the light. Neither of them ever had to explain the choice to the other. That was the one mercy. There is a smell that comes up from deep in the earth in certain places, not the smell of soil, which is alive and familiar and carries the memory of rain. This is older than that. It comes from somewhere below the soil, below the rock, from the places where the earth is still doing whatever it was doing before any living thing arrived to notice. Sulfur and something underneath the sulfur that does not have a name, because the people who would have named it did not last long enough in its presence to sit down and think about what to call it. That smell rose from the slopes of Parnassus. It had been rising for a long time. The thing that lived there was called Python. The accounts disagree on exactly what it looked like. The way accounts tend to disagree about things that very few people survived seeing directly. What they agree on is scale, enormous in the way that geological things are enormous. Something you do not comprehend all at once, but have to move around and look at from different angles before your mind can hold the whole of it. It moved through the valleys below Parnassus the way weather moves, as a system rather than a creature, displacing the air around it, changing the quality of the light. It was old. That is the most important thing about Python. And it is the thing that gets lost when the story gets told too quickly. Python was old in the way that the earth is old, something that had been present through enough centuries that it had stopped being a creature and started being a feature of the landscape. The people in the villages below Parnassus did not think of Python the way you think of a threat. They thought of it the way you think of a volcano or a fault line, something that was simply there, something you organized your life around. The crack in the earth at the top of Parnassus, the one that breathed the sulphurous air up from somewhere deep below, was Python's home. The breath that came up from that crack was the breath of the earth itself, the raw, unprocessed voice of whatever the world was saying down there in the dark, before it had been organized into anything a human being could understand. Python guarded that voice, had been guarding it since before there were people on the slopes of Parnassus to be afraid of it. Apollo came from the south. He was young by the standards that apply to gods, which is to say, he had not yet accumulated the weight that would later settle into him. The long centuries of loss and watching the same mistakes happen across different generations of human beings. He was still moving with the particular energy of something that has recently arrived in the world and has not yet discovered its own limits. He had his bow. He had his silver arrows. He had the absolute clarity of purpose that comes before experience has had the chance to complicate things. The climb up Parnassus was long. The air changed as he went up. The clean sea air of the lower slopes giving way to something denser and stranger. That sulphur smell threading through everything. The ground itself seeming to push back slightly against each step, the way ground does not usually push back. The trees thinned. The rock showed through. The path narrowed to the width of one person walking carefully. He kept going. The thing about Apollo, the thing that stays consistent across every version of every story told about him, is that he does not stop. He deliberates sometimes. He makes mistakes frequently. He does things he later wishes he had not done. But he does not stop. There is something in him that keeps moving forward through the places where stopping would be easier. And it does not announce itself or make speeches about it. It simply keeps his feet moving. His feet kept moving. Python became aware of him the way large old things become aware of small new things. Slowly, and then, all at once, the valley below the summit went quiet in the particular way that valleys go quiet when something very large shifts its attention. The sulphur smell thickened. The ground vibrated with a low, persistent hum that you felt in your teeth more than heard with your ears. Then it came. What happened on the slopes of Parnassus was more like a weather event than a battle. Something enormous moving through the world, and something smaller and much faster moving against it. Finding the angles. Keeping the distance. Apollo fought the way he always fought. From far away, he used his silver arrows. The ones that do not miss. He stayed back and he aimed and he released and he moved and he aimed again. And Python bled the way old things bleed when they are finally wounded. Slowly, as if the body cannot quite believe what is happening to it. As if it has existed long enough to have stopped expecting to end. It ended. It took a long time, but it ended when it was over. Apollo stood on the slope of Parnassus, in the silence that follows the ending of something that has been making noise for a very long time. And he looked at what he had done. Python lay across the mountainside. Already the body was beginning to do what very old things do when they finally stop, dissolving back into the earth it had come from. The boundary between the creature and the ground becoming less clear by the hour. The crack in the earth was still there. The sulphur breath was still rising. The voice of the deep earth was still speaking in its unorganized way, rising up through the rock and into the cold mountain air. It just had no guardian anymore. Apollo stood at the edge of the crack and breathed the air that came out of it and listened to whatever it was saying. He understood something then. The earth had been speaking since before anyone was listening. The speaking did not require an audience to be real, and the voice needed a house. Something that took this raw, rising truth and gave it a form that human beings could approach and question and leave with something they could carry back down the mountain. He would build that house here. But first he had to do something else. He had killed something ancient on this mountain. That required acknowledgement. The Greeks understood this in a way that is easy to miss if you approach their religion as a collection of stories rather than a living system of thought. Killing, even justified killing, left a mark. The mark had to be addressed. You could not simply win and walk away and act as if the winning had cost nothing. It just made it compound. Apollo went away from Parnassus. He went to the valley of Tempe, where the river ran clear and the laurel trees grew along the banks. And he stayed there long enough for the earth to recognize that he had acknowledged what he had done, that the victory was real and the cost of it was real, and he was not pretending either one away. Then he came back. He built Delphi on the body of the thing he had killed. That is not a comfortable fact. And the stories do not spend much time making you comfortable with it. The most sacred place in the Greek world, the place where truth was dispensed and futures were glimpsed and kings came to ask the most important questions of their lives, was built on a wound, on a place where something old had been ended to make room for something new. There is something worth sitting with in that, not a judgment, just a fact that the ground itself has always known. The way ground knows things, quietly and without comment, and for a very long time. He built Delphi. He built it on what he had killed, and the earth kept breathing underneath it, the same breath it had always breathed, and the voice kept rising, and now there was finally something to receive it. The line started before dawn. It always started before dawn. That was not a rule written on the walls of the sanctuary. But it was understood. If you had traveled weeks on the road and spent money you did not have on the sacred offerings and the ritual preparations, you did not sleep in on the morning of your appointment. You were there before the light came up. You stood in the cold with the other people who had come from their own long distances with their own questions. And you waited. The waiting was part of it. Looking back, the waiting was maybe the most important part, because in the line, in the dark, with the smell of laurel burning somewhere inside the sanctuary and the sound of the sacred spring running somewhere below, you had nothing to do but think about your question. And the longer you stood there thinking about your question, the more you realized, if you were paying attention, that you already knew the answer to some of what you had come here to ask. The oracle worked. Not always. Not perfectly. Not in the way that a weather forecast works, where you can check afterward and say right or wrong with a clean judgment, but in the way that a very wise and very strange thing works when you approach it correctly. It gave you something to think with that you had not had before. Croesus came to Delphi. He was the king of Lydia, one of the wealthiest kingdoms in the ancient world, and he had the confidence that wealth tends to produce. He had sent rich gifts to Delphi before he came himself. Golden bowls and silver vessels and enough treasure to make the priests understand that this visitor expected a particular quality of service. He asked his question, "If I march against Persia, will I win?" The oracle answered, "If Croesus marches against Persia, a great empire will fall." Croesus went home satisfied. He had his answer. He marched against Persia, and a great empire fell. His own. He had not asked which empire. He had assumed the answer meant what he wanted it to mean, and the oracle had not corrected him, because the oracle did not correct people. It gave you the truth in the form the truth actually came in, which was not always the form you wanted it in, and what you did with it was your own business. This is the thing that Apollo built, a system for distributing the truth of things to people who were not always ready to receive the truth of things. The Pythia sat in the inner chamber of the temple, the place that almost no one was allowed to enter. She sat on a tripod above the crack in the earth, the same crack that had been there since before Apollo, the one that breathed up the earth's deep air into the cool stone of the sanctuary. She breathed that air. She entered the state that the Greeks called enthusiasmos, which means something close to having a god inside you. And she spoke. What she said was recorded by the priests and rendered into the form given to the person who had asked, sometimes in verse, sometimes in prose, always in the particular quality of language that carries more than one meaning without being dishonest about any of them. The words above the temple door said, "Know thyself." Apollo had put them there. He had meant them, gnothisauton, 2 words carved into the stone of the most visited threshold in the Greek world. Know yourself. Know what you want and why you want it, and what you are actually asking when you think you are asking something simple. Know which empire you are really worried about. He spent his entire existence handing that instruction to other people, and not quite following it himself. But that is later in the story. The people kept coming. They came from Sparta and Athens and Corinth, and from places further away than that. From the coasts of Asia Minor, and from the western Greek colonies in what is now Sicily and southern Italy, and from even further, when the reputation of the place had spread far enough. They came with their questions about war and succession and harvest and sickness, and whether the man their daughter wanted to marry was a good choice, and what the gods wanted them to do about the strange thing that had happened last winter, that no one could explain. They brought their questions, and they left with their answers, and the answers were true and useless and essential, all at the same time. The way truth tends to be when you finally get close enough to it to actually look at it. The sacred spring ran cold under the mountain. The laurel burned in the temple, and the smoke went up, and the smell of it drifted down the slope and into the valley, where the pilgrims camped and waited for their turn to climb up and ask. And Apollo sat at the center of it. Not physically. He was not in the room. The Pythia was in the room, and the priests, and the smoke, and the voice of the earth coming up through the crack. Apollo was somewhere else, the way he was always somewhere else, present in the system rather than in any specific location within it. The god of truth, running the most important truth-telling institution the ancient world would ever produce, giving people the answers they had asked for in the form the answers actually came in. And the answers were real, and the answers were maddening, and the answers required something from the people who received them, which was the willingness to understand that the truth does not simplify things. It just illuminates them, and illumination, as Apollo knew better than anyone, can be harder to live with than the dark. Know thyself, said the words above the door. He had put them there because he meant them, what he had not expected, when he carved them into the stone of the most sacred threshold in the Greek world, was that he was also writing them to himself. The line formed again the next morning before dawn. It always did. The earth kept breathing under the temple floor, and the questions kept coming, the way questions always come when there is somewhere to bring them, endlessly, because that is what human beings do in the presence of something that might know more than they do. They ask. They have always asked. They will always ask. The cattle were gone. Apollo noticed it, the way you notice something that should be there and is not. That particular quality of absence that is different from a space that was always empty. The meadow in Pieria, where he kept his herd, had the right size and the right color and the right quality of morning light coming across it. And it had no cattle in it. He stood at the edge of the meadow for a moment. Then he understood. There was only one person in the entirety of existence who would steal from Apollo and feel good about it. Only one person with the particular combination of audacity and good humor and complete absence of the kind of fear that normally keeps people from doing things like stealing a god's cattle. Only one person who could pull something like that off and still be, somehow, impossible to genuinely dislike. Hermes had been born 3 days ago. 3 days. The child had been alive for 3 days and had already committed a theft of this scale, and Apollo had to admit, privately, in the part of himself he did not often let out into the open, that it was impressively fast work. He followed the trail. It was not a straightforward trail. Hermes had walked the cattle backwards, their hoofprints pointing in the wrong direction, a detail clever enough to have confused anyone who was not paying close attention. Apollo was paying close attention. He followed the backwards hoofprints to the cave on Mount Selene where Hermes had been born and where he had apparently returned after his successful theft to lie in his cradle and pretend to be a newborn. Apollo pushed open the door of the cave. Hermes was lying there wrapped in his swaddling clothes, looking with tremendous sincerity like a baby who had done absolutely nothing wrong. The cattle were not in the cave. "Where are my cattle?" Apollo said. Hermes looked up with the specific expression of someone who has prepared for this exact conversation and is ready to be delightful throughout it. He said he was a baby. He said he had just been born. He said he did not know what cattle were. He said all of this very convincingly. Apollo, who was the god of truth and could recognize the absence of it with some precision, was not convinced. He picked up Hermes, cradle and all, and took him to Olympus, where Zeus was waiting with the particular expression of a father who has heard about this already and is trying very hard not to find it funny. Zeus told Hermes to give back the cattle. Hermes, who knew when a negotiation had reached its ceiling, agreed. He led Apollo to where the cattle were hidden. He had slaughtered 2 of them and made offerings to the 12 Olympian gods, which was either a very pious act or an extremely calculated one, depending on how you looked at it. The remaining cattle were there, alive and accounted for. Apollo looked at them and looked at Hermes and tried to hold on to the irritation the situation technically warranted. It was getting harder to hold on to, because Hermes was sitting on a rock nearby doing something Apollo had never seen before. He was playing an instrument. It was small, the size of something you could hold in both hands, made from a tortoise shell with strings stretched across the opening. Hermes had made it that morning, apparently, in between stealing cattle and impersonating a newborn. He had hollowed out the shell, stretched gut strings across it, and discovered that when you plucked those strings in the right way, they produced something that the air seemed to want to hold on to. Music. Not music the way the word is used casually. Music in the original sense. The thing that moves through the living world in ways that the living world cannot quite explain and does not entirely want to. Apollo had always understood music theoretically. He had known it as a fact about the world. The way certain mathematical relationships produce certain sounds and certain sounds produce certain responses in living things. He had not had an instrument in his hands before. He listened. Hermes played. The meadow went quiet in the particular way that meadows go quiet when something is happening worth paying attention to. The cattle stood still. The light coming through the trees held itself at an angle that seemed designed to make the moment look the way it felt. Apollo stood with his arms at his sides and listened to his 3-day-old brother play a tortoise shell with strings on it, and felt something move through him that he did not have a precise word for. He wanted it. Not the tortoise shell specifically, not Hermes's particular version of whatever he was playing, which was accomplished for someone 3 days old, but admittedly still rough in places. He wanted what the tortoise shell represented. The ability to take what he knew, all of it, the order and the light and the truth and the long, clear view from the chariot above the world, and put it into a form that could be heard rather than just known. He had been the god of light and prophecy and reason and truth. He was about to become the god of music. Hermes, who understood opportunity, the way gods of travelers and commerce understand it, which is to say, immediately and completely, looked up from the instrument and smiled. He offered a trade, the lyre for the cattle, all of the remaining cattle, every last one, plus the acknowledgement that Hermes had shown real creative talent in making the instrument, and that the instrument was worth what Apollo was paying for it. Apollo agreed before Hermes finished the sentence. He took the lyre in both hands, and he played a single note, and the note went out across the meadow and up into the sky, and the silence afterward was the kind of silence that happens when something has just been said that cannot be unsaid. He stood there with the instrument in his hands. Hermes watched him with the expression of someone who already knows how something is going to go and is enjoying watching it arrive. There are changes that happen inside a person, or a god, in the place where the sense of self lives and does its quiet work. Apollo had been one kind of god before that morning in the meadow. He was a slightly different kind of god after it. The light was the same. The arrows were the same. The prophecies and the temples and the long view from the chariot were all the same. But now there was music, and music did something the other things had not done. It gave him a way to be present in the world that was not about knowing or seeing or predicting or ordering. It was about feeling along the length of a string and finding the note that lived there and letting it out into the air where other things could hear it and respond. He had always been the god who watched from a distance. Music was the first thing that closed the distance, not all the way. Nothing would ever close it all the way. And that is its own kind of story. But some, enough to matter, enough to feel. In the moment when the note went out across the meadow, and the cattle stood still, and his 3-day-old brother grinned at him from the rock, like something that had been missing had arrived. He walked home with the lyre and without the cattle. He had made, by any practical accounting, a terrible trade. He would play that lyre for the rest of his existence. And there would be days, long afterward, when things were hard, in the ways that things get hard, when you have lived long enough and loved enough and lost enough, when he would sit down with it and play until the playing had taken the edge off whatever the day had put into him. Hermes gave him that. A 3-day-old child with a tortoiseshell and an eye for what things are worth gave the god of light the one tool that could soften him. That is not a small thing to give, even if it did cost Apollo every single one of his cattle. There is a moment that comes in certain kinds of pursuit, when the thing being chased understands something, the thing doing the chasing has not yet understood. The moment when the distance between them stops being a problem to be closed, and starts being the only thing keeping the world from going wrong. Daphne understood that moment. Apollo had not reached it yet. This story begins, the way several of Apollo's stories begin, with Eros, the small god with the bow, which is always worth pausing on. Eros with a bow, Apollo with a bow. The thing that makes you fall in love and the thing that kills from a distance share the same basic instrument. The Greeks knew that. They built it into the mythology deliberately, or noticed it in the world and reflected it back, which amounts to the same thing. Apollo had said something he should not have said. He had looked at Eros, small and winged, and carrying his bow, and he had made the mistake that confident people make when they see someone smaller than themselves doing something they are also good at. He had said, with the particular condescension that is most damaging when it comes from someone who is otherwise genuinely impressive, that Eros should put down the bow and leave the serious weapons to the gods who knew how to use them. Eros looked at him. Then Eros went and got 2 arrows. One was gold, tipped with a point designed to open the heart, to love the way a key opens a lock, cleanly and completely. No resistance. The other was lead, tipped with something that worked in the opposite direction. That closed the heart against a specific person as completely as the gold one opened it. He shot Apollo with the gold arrow. He shot Daphne with the lead one, and then he watched, with the satisfaction of someone who has made a very clean point, to see what happened next. What happened was, Apollo saw Daphne. It was not a gradual thing, not the slow accumulation of admiration that builds over time into something larger. It was immediate, the kind of seeing that changes the quality of the air around you, where the person you are looking at becomes the thing your eyes go to, regardless of what else is in the field of vision. He saw her, and everything else in the landscape stepped back. He went toward her. Daphne ran. Now, this story has been told many ways over many centuries, and some of those ways are easier to hear than others. There is a version that romanticizes the pursuit, that treats the running as part of a courtship, that interprets what happened next as a kind of surrender to something inevitable. That version misses what the story is actually about. Daphne was a daughter of the river god Peneus. She had asked her father, early in her life, For the same gift Artemis had been granted. The gift of being exempt from the whole apparatus of romantic pursuit and expectation that the ancient world organized around women with particular efficiency. Her father had looked at her and agreed. She did not want to be chased. She did not want to be caught. She wanted what she had always wanted, which was the freedom to exist in the world on her own terms, without having to manage what she generated in the people around her, simply by being what she was. She ran. She was fast. That matters. She was not helpless or slow or someone waiting to be overtaken. She ran because she was fast and the forest was familiar to her, and she was not ready to stop running. Apollo was faster, because the gold arrow was working on him with a ferocity that translated directly into speed. And the distance between them was closing. She called to her father. She called to him running. With the sound of Apollo behind her, and the trees going past on both sides, and the river ahead that she had grown up beside, and she asked him to do the one thing left to do. Change her. Take the form that was causing the problem, and replace it with something that the problem could not follow into. The river heard her. The change started at her feet. Bark. Not gradually. Not 1 degree at a time. All at once. The way things change in myths, because that is the kind of change myths deal in. The kind that reveals in an instant what has been true for much longer. Bark at her feet and moving up, and her hands going still at her sides as the fingers elongated into branches, and her hair lifting in the wind, becoming leaves. Apollo stopped. He stood at the edge of where she had been a moment before, and he looked at what was in front of him, and the gold arrow was still working, and that was perhaps the cruelest part of all of it. That the thing Eros had put in him did not stop when the chase ended. He had loved her running, and he loved her still. This tree that was warm under his hands, in a way that bark should not be warm, that still held some quality of the thing it had just been. He put his hands on the tree. He stood there. He did not move for a long time. When he finally spoke, it was not with the voice he used for prophecy or for music or for the formal declarations that gods make when they are speaking for the record. It was quieter than that. It was the voice of someone saying something in a room where no one else can hear. Even if the other person was no longer precisely a person and the room was a riverbank and the words were going into bark instead of ears, he said the laurel would be his tree, his symbol, the thing associated with him across all the years that were coming. He said he would carry it. He said the great ones, the ones who achieved the things worth achieving, would wear it on their heads. He said he would make it mean something. He kept that promise. Every wreath placed on the head of a poet, every crown set on the brow of a champion, every image of Apollo himself in every painting and every statue across every century that came after. The laurel is there. You have seen it without knowing what you were looking at. The leaves that mean victory and achievement and the highest recognition one human being can give to another. All of it came from a riverbank. All of it came from a man standing with his hands on a tree that was still warm. He stood there until the bark went cold under his hands. Then he turned and walked back the way he had come. The laurel stayed on the riverbank and grew the way trees grow, slowly and without hurry, putting its roots down into the ground beside its father's river. He wore the laurel after that. He wears it still, in every painting and every statue. That crown of leaves that was never a crown. It was an apology to a woman who was not there to receive it. And every poet who ever sat down to write something true and difficult and placed their faith in the idea that the work was worth doing was, without knowing it, wearing the same apology. The river ran past the place where the tree stood. The wind moved through the leaves. The tree kept growing. Trees like that do not stop. The morning started well. That is the thing about the mornings that end badly. They do not announce themselves. They come in with the same quality of light as every other morning, the same sounds, the same air, and you move through the first hours of them without any indication that this particular day is going to be the one you carry for the rest of your life. This morning had good light, the kind of light that falls across an open field in the way that makes everything in it look like it was placed there deliberately. Like the whole landscape is a composition that someone spent time on. The grass was still holding the night's dew, and it caught the early sun and threw it back in small, cold sparks. The air had that quality it gets in certain parts of Greece in the middle of the year. Warm and dry, and moving just enough to be felt without being wind. Apollo was happy. That is worth saying plainly because it does not get said often enough in the stories about him. He was happy that morning. He was in a field with someone he loved, and the light was good, and there was nowhere he needed to be, and nothing that required his attention. And for once, the long view from above, the one that showed him everything and everyone and every consequence of every choice, was not the view he was taking. He was just there, in the field, with Hyacinthus. Hyacinthus was from Sparta, which produced a particular kind of person. Someone shaped by a place that believed difficulty was the point, that the purpose of a good morning was to prepare you for a hard afternoon. But Hyacinthus had something underneath the Spartan formation, some quality that the training had not reached because it lived too deep, a kind of brightness that had nothing to do with achievement or strength, and everything to do with the simple fact of how it felt to be near him. Apollo had noticed that brightness from a distance, the way he noticed most things, from a distance, but with Hyacinthus the distance had closed in a way it rarely did, not because of an arrow or a divine compulsion, but because Hyacinthus had been interested in return, genuinely and without complication, and Apollo had not quite known what to do with that. He was accustomed to pursuing or being asked for something. He was not accustomed to someone simply wanting to spend time with him because the time itself was good. He had learned to be accustomed to it. They spent time together the way people spend time together when they are not trying to be anywhere else. Long mornings and slow afternoons. They hunted sometimes. They swam. They sat in the shade of whatever trees were nearby and talked about things that did not need to be talked about but were good to talk about anyway. Apollo played his lyre sometimes, and Hyacinthus listened the way people listen to music when they are not listening for anything in particular, just letting it move through them, and they threw the discus. That was Hyacinthus's game, the one he was best at, the one that satisfied something in him that other things did not. The discus requires the whole body working together, the rotation and the release, and the follow-through. And there is a moment at the peak of the throw when everything has been given to the object in your hand, and it is no longer yours, and it is going where physics and your own skill are sending it, and there is nothing left to do but watch. Hyacinthus loved that moment. Apollo had come to love it too. The watching of it, the way Hyacinthus looked at the apex of the throw, with his whole body still carrying the shape of the motion that had just ended. They were taking turns. The field was empty in all directions. The sun was at the angle it reaches in the middle of the morning, high enough to be warm but not yet at the full weight of afternoon. Apollo threw, and the discus went out and came down somewhere in the far grass, and Hyacinthus went to retrieve it, moving through the field, the way he moved, with the ease of someone comfortable in their body, someone who had spent a life learning what their body could do and was at peace with the knowledge. There was a third presence in that field that morning. Zephyrus, the west wind, the warm wind, the one that comes in off the water in the late afternoon and brings the smell of the sea inland. Zephyrus had his own feelings about Hyacinthus, and they were not dissimilar to Apollo's feelings, which is to say, they were significant and not entirely rational, and had been there long enough to have become structural, part of how Zephyrus understood the world and his place in it. Zephyrus had been watching the field for a while. When Hyacinthus threw the discus, and the discus went up into the arc of its flight, Zephyrus made a small adjustment, just a breath of wind, just enough. The discus did not go where it was going. It went somewhere else, The field went quiet in a way that fields do not usually go quiet. Not the natural quiet of a place where nothing is happening, but the quiet of a place where something has happened that is too large for the surrounding air to process immediately. Apollo was across the field and moving before the quiet had fully settled, covering the distance in the way that gods cover distances when there is something urgent at the other end of them. He reached Hyacinthus. He knelt down in the grass. He was the god of healing. He was the father of the greatest healer who would ever live. He had knowledge of medicine that no mortal physician could approach. He had, in his long existence, healed things that human medicine did not have words for. He could not heal this. There are limits to what even the most powerful things can do when the damage is of a certain kind, and the moment has already passed the point at which intervention is possible. Apollo understood this in his mind, and his hands did not accept it. He stayed beside Hyacinthus in the grass, and he tried everything he knew, and the grass around them darkened with what was being lost. He stayed there. The field was still. Zephyrus was gone, the way wind is gone when it has done what it came to do, leaving no evidence of intention, only the consequence of a small adjustment made at the wrong moment in the wrong direction. Later, when later became possible, Apollo looked at the ground, where the blood of Hyacinthus had fallen into the grass. Something was growing, a flower, dark at the center, purple at the edges. The color of the hour before the sun goes down, when the light has changed enough to make everything look slightly different than it does in full day. Small and deliberate. The way flowers are deliberate, even when they are not. Doing what they do without apology and without fanfare. He named it. He always named the things he lost. That was the pattern he was building without fully knowing he was building it. Daphne became the laurel. Hyacinthus became the flower. The losses accumulated their memorials, the way coastlines accumulate their lighthouses. One at a time. Each one marking a place where something went wrong. He named the flower and he looked at it in the grass, and the morning that had started so well was over, in a way that mornings are over when they have been the last of something. He had been happy. That was the part he could not move away from, as the day wore on, and the sun crossed the sky above him, and the field that had been so full of good light in the early hours held only the long shadows of late afternoon. He had been genuinely happy that morning. The field, and the light, and the throwing, and the simple, uncomplicated fact of being somewhere good with someone he wanted to be there with. He had not known it was the last time. You never know when it is the last time. That is the thing that the gods, for all their foresight and their long view, could not fix. Apollo could see the future in many of its aspects, and he could not see this. Or perhaps he could see it, and it had been too far off to register as something immediate. The way a storm on the horizon does not feel real until the first drops of rain land on your face. He had been happy, and then the wind had moved. And then he was in a field holding someone who could not be held back. Some things cannot be turned into trees or temples or symbols. Some things can only be turned into flowers, small and seasonal and gone before the summer ends. He named them anyway. He always named the things he lost. And every spring after that, in the fields of Sparta and the gardens of the Greek world, and the places where the soil was dark enough and wet enough for them to grow, the flowers came back, small and purple at the edges, dark at the center, the way grief is dark at the center, returning every year, whether you asked it to or not. Troy was a beautiful city. That is not irrelevant. The beauty of Troy matters to the story, not as backdrop, but as context, because the things that happen to beautiful things carry a different weight than the things that happen to ordinary ones. We expect ordinary things to end badly. We do not expect it of the beautiful ones. Even when the evidence in front of us is clear. Even when someone is standing on the wall telling us exactly what is coming. We do not expect it, and so we do not hear. Cassandra was a princess of Troy, daughter of Priam and Hecuba. sister of Hector and Paris and many others, part of the royal family of the most beautiful city in the Greek world. She had grown up inside those walls, the high limestone walls that caught the afternoon light and held it, that turned gold in the early evening and then darkened to the grey-brown of stone at night. She knew those walls the way you know the walls of the house you grew up in, from the inside, from the outside, at every hour and in every kind of weather. She loved them. Apollo came to Troy because Troy was worth coming to. It was the kind of city that attracted divine attention, not through prayer alone, but through the quality of its existence, through the care that had gone into it and the beauty that had resulted from that care. He came to Troy, and he saw Cassandra. She was standing on the high wall looking out over the water. He went to her. What passed between them, the accounts preserve in outline rather than detail, which is frustrating and also probably accurate, because the most important conversations tend to leave behind only their shapes rather than their words. What the outline shows is this. Apollo offered Cassandra the gift of prophecy, the ability to see what was coming, to know the future the way he knew it, with the clarity and the weight of real knowledge rather than the uncertain readings of ordinary human intuition. It was not a small offer. The gift of prophecy was the closest thing Apollo had to a center. It was the thing that most essentially defined him among his many domains. To give it to a mortal was to give something that cost him something real to give. He gave it. She took it. And then she told him no. What happened next is the part of the story that gets told most often and understood least well. Apollo could not take back the gift. That was the rule. Not arbitrary, but structural, built into the nature of divine gifts, the way certain rules are built into the nature of language. You can unsay some things. You cannot unsay others. A gift of this kind, once given, was given. He could not take it back, but he could do something else. He could make it so that no one believed her. He did that. Now, there is a way to tell this story that makes it a story about revenge, about a god retaliating in the most devastating way available to him. That version is not wrong exactly, but it is incomplete in a way that matters. Because what Apollo did to Cassandra was not simply punishment. It was something stranger and more terrible than punishment. He left her with the truth. He left her with full knowledge of every disaster that was coming. He did not take her sight, or her mind, or her voice. He left her completely intact, with every terrible thing she was going to see fully visible before it happened. And he simply removed the one thing that would have made the knowledge bearable, the ability to be heard. Think about what that means. Cassandra saw the horse. She stood in the square of Troy when the Greeks left it on the beach outside the walls, and she looked at it and she knew. She knew in the particular way that she always knew things now. Not as suspicion nor as fear, but as fact, as something already true that just had not happened in the visible world yet. She knew what was inside it. She knew what would happen when the Trojans brought it through the gates. She knew how the fires would start and which direction they would spread, and which of the people she loved would not be alive by morning. She said it. She went into the square and she said it plainly, and without the kind of delivery that might have allowed people to dismiss her on those grounds. She said it calmly, which was harder than the alternative, and which she had learned to do across the years of being right and unheard, because the calm was all she had left that was hers. She said what was inside the horse and what would happen, and she asked them not to bring it through the gate. The Trojans looked at the horse. They looked at Cassandra. They brought the horse through the gate. She watched them do it. She had always known she would watch them do it. That is the specific cruelty of what Apollo had made her life into. It was not that she saw the disasters coming and could not stop them. It was that she saw them coming and could not even have the ordinary human consolation of having tried and failed in a way that anyone acknowledged. She did try. She always tried. She said the things she saw in language as clear as she could make it, to people as close to her as she could reach. And it did not matter. She was right every time, and it did not matter. every time, and the disasters came anyway, one after another. Across the years of Troy's remaining life, the city burned exactly the way she said it would. She stood inside it while it burned, because by then there was nowhere else to stand. And she was right about every detail of that too. The direction of the fire and the sounds it made, and what happened to the people she had loved all her life inside those walls that had been beautiful in the afternoon light and were now doing something else entirely in the firelight. She had known. She had always known. And Apollo, who had made sure of that, watched from the sky. He drove across every morning, and the smoke from Troy rose up through the clean air above him, and he did not look away from it. He was the God of truth. He had given the most complete and honest gift of truth he had in his possession to a woman in a beautiful city, and then he had made the truth into something that ate her alive from the inside for the rest of her life. He was not simple. Apollo. He was never simple. The people who approach him looking for simple things, for the clean God of sunshine and music and pleasant prophecy, find eventually that they have not looked closely enough. He was complicated in the way that powerful things are, complicated when they act on the world without fully understanding themselves. He had feelings about Cassandra. He did what he did because of those feelings, and the gap between what he felt and what he did with what he felt was wide enough to hold an entire city. Troy fell. Cassandra was right. She was taken to Greece afterward, which is its own story and not a better one. And somewhere in the sky above all of it, the chariot moved across the clean blue distance, and the God of truth was present in the way he was always present, distant, accurate, and carrying, maybe, the particular kind of weight that you carry when you have done something that cannot be undone, and you understand exactly what you have done, because understanding exactly is the one thing you were built for. He understood. He had always understood. That was never the problem. The problem was the distance between understanding and doing differently. That is a very human problem for a god to have. He had it anyway. The raven was white. That is the first thing to know, because it matters to how the story ends. In the time before this story, ravens were white, the way fresh snow is white, completely and without exception, and they served Apollo as his messengers, the way certain birds serve certain gods in the old accounts, carrying information across the distances that gods themselves chose not to cross in person. Apollo used ravens because he trusted them. He trusted them because they were accurate. They saw what they saw and reported what they saw without addition or subtraction, without the interpretive layer that human messengers applied to everything they carried, because human beings cannot help interpreting. The raven saw a thing, and the raven said the thing, and the thing it said was the thing it had seen. That was what Apollo valued. Accuracy. He had built his entire existence around it. Coronis was from Thessaly, from the lake country in the north, where the water is cold, even in summer, and the mountains are close enough to the sky that the people who live between them develop a particular quality of self-sufficiency, a sense that the world is fundamentally theirs to navigate without excessive help from outside. She was mortal in the full weight of that word, living in the time that mortals live in, bounded by it, shaped by it, in the ways that mortality shapes everything it touches. Apollo loved her, with the particular quality of love that Apollo brought to everything he loved, which was complete and intense, and not always fully aware of itself. He did not love her the way you love something you are holding carefully, because you know it can break. He loved her the way the sun loves the ground it falls on, without reservation, and without always fully understanding what the love was doing to the thing it fell on. She was carrying his child. That was already true when the raven found what it found. The raven had been watching, the way ravens watch, from a height, and with the clean attention of something that has no stake in what it sees beyond the seeing of it. It saw Coronis with another man, a mortal man, Isis, from the same lake country, someone she had known before Apollo, someone who existed on the same plane of time and mortality and ordinary human need that she existed on. The raven flew to Apollo. It told him what it had seen. Accurately, Apollo heard what the raven said. And here is where the story turns on something small. The way stories about powerful people often turn on something small. A moment that presents itself as an obvious reaction rather than a decision with alternatives. He did not stop. He did not do the thing that the God of Truth should have been best equipped to do, which was to take what he had been told and hold it at the distance of his own intelligence and ask what it actually meant and what he actually knew and what he did not know and what the right response would be to what he actually knew as opposed to what he felt in the moment of knowing it. He acted. The fire that came from that decision was not slow. Coronis died. She died in Thessaly by the lake she had grown up beside, and the mountains she had looked at her whole life were there, and the cold summer water was there, and Apollo was not there, because Apollo was never in the room. He was the god who acted from a distance, and this was true of his love, and true of his anger, and true of the worst thing he ever did, which he did from far away with the full force of what he was. And then it was over, and the silence that came after was the specific silence of something that cannot be taken back. He went to Thessaly. He stood at the edge of what the fire had left. Everything that the God of Truth was had always been pointed outward, toward the world, toward other people, toward the future and its unfolding. He had been right about so many things. He had been accurate about so many things. And he had just done the most inaccurate thing he had ever done in his existence, which was to act on partial information as though it were complete, to hear one thing and turn it into a conclusion that required many more things to be true before it could be what he had treated it as. He had not asked her. That was the thing he kept arriving at. Standing in Thessaly in the aftermath of what he had done, he had not asked her. He had heard the raven's report, and he had not done the one thing that all of his gifts and all of his long existence should have made him capable of. He had not stopped. He had not asked. He had not brought his understanding of truth to bear on the situation in which he found himself, because the situation had gotten inside the distance he maintained from everything, and when things got inside that distance he did not always behave like the God of Truth. He behaved like something much less composed than that. Something much more like a person. The raven was nearby. It had perched in a tree at the edge of the field, and it was watching him the way ravens watch things, with the focused attention of something that does not have feelings about what it is looking at. He looked at the raven. He thought about accuracy. He thought about what the raven had done, which was to see a thing and report a thing and do its job with the fidelity he had always relied on and rewarded. And he thought about what that accurate report had become in his hands. He changed the raven's color, not as punishment exactly, as punishment in the way that people punish things that are not guilty, because the things that are guilty are not available to be punished, and something has to receive what is building up inside you, or it will do something worse. He turned the white feathers black. All of them. Completely. The white messenger of the God of Light became the black bird that it still is, carrying the change forward across every generation of ravens that came after. He did not feel better. That is always the problem with redirected anger. It finds a target and it finds its release, and at the end of it you are standing in exactly the same place you were before, except now there is an additional thing wrong. There was still the child. Coronis had been carrying his child, and the child was still there somehow in the aftermath of everything. The way certain things survive the things that should have ended them, because they have not yet had the chance to begin. Apollo did what could be done. He reached into what the fire had left, and he found the child, and he carried the child out of it. The child was alive. He was small and complete, and entirely unaware of the particular circumstances of his arrival into the world, which was probably merciful. Apollo held him. He stood in Thessaly, in the silence of what he had done, and he held the child who had survived it, and he looked at this small person, who was half his and half Coronis's, and therefore half something that no longer existed in the world, the way it had existed that morning. He could not give the child what he had taken from him. There was no system for that. No oracler, no Templar, no sacrifice that addressed that specific debt. He had done what he had done, and the child would grow up in the shape of it, whether Apollo acknowledged the shape or not. He named the child Asclepius. He carried him to Chiron, the centaur who lived in the hills and knew more about the living world than any teacher in Greece, who could teach a child what the world was made of and how to work with what it gave you. He left the child there. He walked back out into the world. The raven in the tree watched him go, black feathers now, sitting very still, and Apollo walked back toward the sky and the chariot and the long daily work of carrying the light that everything below depended on. And the distance between himself and the ground opened back up to its usual size, and he was again the thing he was most comfortable being, far away, accurate and wrong, this once, in a way that had cost more than anything he had ever paid before. He knew it. He had always known things. That was the part that did not get easier. Chiron lived in a cave in the hills of Thessaly, not because he lacked options. Chiron was the greatest teacher in the Greek world. He had taught Achilles and Jason and a dozen other heroes whose names bent the shape of history. He could have lived anywhere. He had the connections and the reputation to demand better accommodations than a cave in the hills. He lived in the cave because the cave was close to the world he taught from. The herbs grew on the hillsides around it. The animals moved through the forest below it. The rivers ran through the valley within reach of it. The sky was visible from the entrance in a way that a building never quite allows the sky to be visible. In the full unedited version, that includes weather and seasons and the slow movements of stars across the dark, everything Chiron taught. He taught from proximity to actual things rather than from a remove. He believed that knowledge lived in the world and you had to go to where it lived. Asclepius grew up understanding that he was a quiet child, which the accounts mention with a consistency that suggests it was distinctive, not shy. Quiet in the way that people are quiet when they are paying attention to something that requires quiet to hear properly. He watched Chiron move through the forest identifying plants, and he watched the way Chiron's hands moved when he was explaining something about a root or a bark or a flower, the quality of attention in the hands themselves. And he learned to move his own hands that way. He had his father's precision. He had something else too, something that came from his mother's side or from the particular conditions of his arrival in the world, or from some combination of things that did not reduce cleanly to either parent. A quality of presence that the people he treated later described as the feeling of being fully seen. The way you want to be seen when you are sick, when the illness has stripped away the constructed version of yourself and left something more fundamental and more vulnerable. And you need someone in the room to understand that what they are looking at is the real thing. Asclepius understood that. He grew into his gift the way certain people grow into theirs. Not by arriving at it, but by following it, by going in the direction it pointed, and finding that the direction kept opening up the further he went. He studied what Chiron taught him, and then he went past what Chiron had taught him, because the knowledge was there in the world to be found, and he had learned from Chiron how to go looking for it. He healed things that should not have been healable, wounds that had been considered fatal, illnesses that the best medical minds of Greece had watched kill person after person and written off as beyond the reach of human medicine. He sat with the sick in his sanctuaries, the ones at Epidaurus and Kos, and the other places that grew up around his name. And he worked with the knowledge he had and the presence he carried and the particular attention he brought to each person who came to him. The sick came from everywhere. They traveled extraordinary distances because the word had spread in the way that words about healing spread. Quickly and without formal announcement, someone is well who was not well. Someone walked out of that sanctuary who arrived there carried. The word moved. They came, and Asclepius saw them, his symbol, the one that endured long after the sanctuaries closed and the ancient world gave way to everything that came after, was the rod of Asclepius. a single serpent winding around a staff. Not the caduceus of Hermes with its 2 snakes and its wings. 1 snake, 1 staff. The image of a healer who had learned from the world and carried what he learned and walked with it into every room where someone was suffering. That symbol is still on the doors of hospitals. Most people who see it no longer know where it came from. But it came from the cave in the Thessalian hills. It came from a quiet child watching Chiron's hands in the forest. It came from the sun, pulled from the fire, carrying his father's precision and his mother's humanity, and something else besides. Something that the particular circumstances of his beginning had put in him that neither parent alone could have given. And then one day someone came who was past the point that the world's rules normally allowed. Asclepius looked at that person and looked at what he knew and looked at the distance between what he knew and what the situation required. And he crossed it. He brought someone back from the dead. The accounts name different people as the one who was brought back. What matters is not the specific name, but the act itself, which was an act of crossing a line that the Greek universe had drawn with considerable care, because the line was structural, foundational, one of the load-bearing elements of how things worked. The living on one side, the dead on the other, Hades below, managing his kingdom with the grim efficiency the Greeks imagined for him. The 2 sides separated, and that separation was the thing that made both sides what they were. Asclepius crossed it. He brought someone back across it. Hades noticed. You do not cross that line without Hades noticing. His kingdom had just lost a citizen, had lost the finality. That was the whole point of his kingdom. And Hades went to Zeus with the complaint, because that is how these things worked. Zeus noticed too. He saw what Asclepius had done, and he understood it, the way a person who is responsible for keeping a large, complicated system functioning understands a decision made by someone inside the system who has optimized for one thing at the expense of everything else. Asclepius had optimized for healing. He had healed so completely that he had healed someone past the point where healing was supposed to be possible. That could not continue. Zeus threw the thunderbolt. Asclepius was gone. Fast. The way that kind of intervention is fast, without the drawn-out quality of illness or age, or the slow diminishments that mortal deaths usually involve. There and then not there. With the transition happening in the space between one moment and the next. Apollo felt it. He felt it from wherever he was in the sky, and he turned toward the feeling, the way you turn toward a sound that is not right, that has the quality of something breaking that was not supposed to break. He went down. He went to wherever the moment had happened, and the absence was complete, and there was no working with an absence of that completeness. His son had been there, and his son was gone, and the things that Apollo was good at, none of them applied to this. He was the god of healing. His son had been the greatest healer who had ever lived, and he was standing in the place where his son had been, and there was nothing in him that was equal to what he was standing in. He went after the Cyclopes. The Cyclopes were Zeus's weapon makers, the ones who had forged the thunderbolts. And Apollo found them, and he killed them. This was not the clean, precise action from far away that characterized most of what Apollo did. This was close, and it was angry, and it came from the place that exists underneath calculation. The place that the god of truth and light and order had always kept carefully managed, because he knew what lived there and what it could do. Zeus was not pleased. He had considered sending Apollo to Tartarus, the deepest and most final of the underworld's accommodations. Leto intervened. Apollo's mother, who had walked across the water in the dark and held the palm tree and found the one island that would hold still for her, went to Zeus and asked for a different judgment. Zeus agreed to a different judgment. Apollo would serve a mortal king for a period of years. He would go down to the human level, to the life of ordinary days and ordinary work, and he would do it without the remove of the chariot, and without the formal distance of the temples, and without any of the apparatus that kept him at the height he was accustomed to. He would live like a person. He would learn something. Apollo stood in the place where his son had been. He thought about the line that Asclepius had crossed, and the reason he had crossed it, and the fact that the reason was the best reason a person or a god could have for anything, which was that someone was suffering, and he had the ability to stop the suffering, and so he had stopped it. He thought about a universe in which that was not allowed. He did not make peace with it. He went and served his sentence, as the next chapter of his life required. But he did not make peace with it. His son had gone further than him. He had always known that was possible. He had not known, until it happened, that the universe would decide it was too far. He knew now. He carried it. He kept going. The road to Thessaly was long. Apollo knew every road in Greece from above. He had looked down at them for centuries. The paths that human beings wore into the earth by walking the same routes, generation after generation, until the ground itself remembered where people needed to go and held the shape of that need in the soil. From the Chariot, roads looked like the lines on an old person's hands, evidence of every direction a life had moved in, pressed permanently into the surface by repetition. He had never walked one before. Not like this. Not as someone who had to start at one end and put one foot in front of the other and cover the ground between where he was and where he was going, the way the ground required it to be covered, at the pace the body allowed. In the weather the sky was producing that day, whether or not the weather was convenient. He walked. The first morning was strange, in a way he had not anticipated. He had expected the reduction in scale, the loss of the long view, the world narrowing from the full sweep of everything visible, from the Chariot to the few hundred feet of road that a walking person can see at any given moment. He had expected that, and it was strange, but it was the strangeness he had prepared for. What he had not prepared for was the smell from the Chariot. The world had no smell, or rather it had something that was not quite smell in the way that human beings use the word, more like the awareness of atmosphere, of the whole planet doing its slow chemical work far below. Walking on the road in the early morning in Thessaly, the smell was specific and close and completely different from one moment to the next. Wet earth where the road dipped through a low place, the sharp smell of pine trees on the hillside to the left, something that had died in the brush nearby some days ago, the clean, cold smell of the river running along the valley below. He noticed all of it. He had not known he would notice all of it. Admetus was a king in the way that the kings of that part of Greece were kings, which is to say, he was a man who was responsible for more people than he could personally know, and who took that responsibility seriously enough that it showed in his face. He had lines around his eyes that came from looking at things carefully over a long period of time. He moved through his household with the quiet authority of someone who does not need to announce themselves because the people around them have already adjusted to their presence. He was a good man. Apollo arrived at his estate in the late afternoon of the second day of walking, dusty from the road and tired in a way that was new, the specific tiredness of a body that has been doing physical work for a sustained period and needs to stop. He presented himself as a laborer looking for work. He did not say his name. He did not say where he had come from or why he had arrived on foot, looking like someone who had been walking for 2 days. Admetus looked at him for a moment. Then he said there was work if he wanted it. Apollo wanted it. The work was the care of cattle and sheep, which required waking before dawn when the air was cold and the animals were restless and needed to be moved from where they had spent the night to where they would spend the day. It required walking, a great deal of walking, more than the road to Thessaly had involved, over uneven ground, with the animals moving at their own pace, which was not Apollo's pace and could not be persuaded to become Apollo's pace, no matter how he felt about it. The animals did not know who he was. That was the first thing. The cattle did not respond to him with any of the recognition that he had become accustomed to from the living world, the slight adjustment that things made in his presence when they understood. At whatever level, things understand such things. that something significant was nearby. The cattle looked at him and saw someone with a stick whose job was to keep them moving in the right direction, and they responded to the stick and the direction, and not at all to anything else. He found this clarifying. The sheep were worse. Sheep are not unintelligent exactly, but they are deeply committed to a particular way of understanding the world, which is that any change in their immediate environment is probably dangerous and should be reacted to with immediate collective panic. And then, 15 seconds later, completely forgotten. Apollo spent the first weeks of his time in Thessaly in a state of perpetual management of sheep-related crises that were not crises. That were the standard operations of sheep going about their sheep business in the way that sheep do. He learned to anticipate them. He learned to read the quality of attention in the flock, the way the heads came up together and the ears changed angle, and there was a collective pause before the panic. And he learned to move to the right position before the pause ended, so that when the panic came, he was already where he needed to be to keep it from becoming a dispersal. It took patience. He had not known patience in the way he came to know it in Thessaly. He had known the patience of the long view, the patience that comes from being able to see far enough ahead to know that what is currently upsetting is going to resolve. That is not the same as the patience required to stand in a field in the rain, while sheep do the things that sheep do, and to respond correctly to each small thing, as it happens, with no access to a larger view that might make the small things feel less small. He learned that patience, it was harder than the other kind. He played his lyre in the evenings. That stayed. Whatever else the exile took from him, the music stayed. And in the evenings, when the animals were settled and the light was going out of the sky over the Thessalian hills, he would sit outside and play, and the sound went out into the darkening air, and the animals were calmer on the mornings. After the evenings, when he had played, he had known this theoretically. He had always known that music moved through the living world in ways that the living world responded to. He had known it from above. He had known it as a fact about the world. In Thessaly, he knew it differently. He knew it as a farmer knows what the rain does, not as information but as something felt in the body, as evidence of what the world actually is. Admetus invited him to eat at his table some evenings, not because he knew who Apollo was. He did not know. He invited him because Admetus was the kind of man who noticed when someone in his household was more than what they appeared to be, who paid attention to the quality of presence that different people brought to the same rooms, and who responded to that quality with the simple human instinct to want to know the person better. They talked about the cattle and the land and the quality of the pasture in different seasons, about the river and whether it would flood in spring, about the politics of the surrounding territory and the relationships between the neighboring kingdoms and the particular difficulty of being a king in a time when those relationships were managed by the constant low-level threat of what happened if they were not managed well. Apollo listened. He was good at listening when he chose to be. And in Thessaly he found himself choosing to be in a way he had not expected. He had spent his existence as the one with the answers, the one who knew, the one people came to with their questions. The oracle at Delphi ran in one direction. People brought their questions to him, and he gave them the truth in the form it came in, and they went away with what they could carry. Admetus was not asking him anything. Admetus was talking to him as one person talks to another, when the talking itself is the point, when there is no transaction involved and no information being exchanged that either party needs for anything. Just the simple and apparently profound human activity of being in the same room and telling each other things. Apollo had not known how much he had missed this. He was not sure he had ever known it was possible to miss it. The months went by. Summer became fall, and fall became the cold Thessalian winter that came hard off the mountains and pressed down into the valleys, and made the mornings with the animals an exercise in negotiating with weather that was not negotiating back. He learned to dress for it the way the farmhands dressed for it, in layers, with attention to practical warmth rather than any other consideration. He learned which parts of the pasture had the best shelter from the north wind and how to move the animals there before the worst of it came. He learned things he had not known there were to learn. That was the surprise of it. The thing that Thessaly gave him that he had not expected to receive. He had assumed the exile would be a reduction, a time of having less than he was accustomed to while he waited for the normal structure of his existence to resume. He had not assumed it would teach him things that his existence had not taught him in all the centuries before it. But it did. He learned that the world is different from the inside than it is from above. He learned that the things that look small from the chariot, the individual lives, the particular days, the specific weight of a cold morning when you have work to do and the weather does not care about your preferences, are not actually small. They are the full size of themselves. They only look small from far away. Delphi had taught Apollo how humans fear death. Thessaly was about to teach him what humans are willing to give for love. But that lesson was still coming. For now there was just the field and the cold air and the animals moving through the grey morning light, and a god who had walked down from the sky and was learning, for the first time in his very long existence, what it felt like to be standing on the ground. On the last morning of his exile, he stood in the field one more time. He looked at the ordinary Thessalian hillside with its ordinary grass and its ordinary sheep doing their ordinary sheep things in the ordinary cold morning air. He stood there for a while. The distance between himself and the ground opened back up as the days went on, and the chariot was there, and the temples were there, and the long clear view of everything that was, and everything that was coming, returned to him. But something had changed in the arrangement of things inside him. Something that 9 years of walking on the ground had put there. It stayed. Some things you carry without knowing you are carrying them until one day you reach for something else and find them there instead. Settled into you so completely that you can no longer remember the shape of the space they occupy. He carried it. He kept going. The house of Admetus was not a large house. It was appropriate to the station of a regional king in northern Thessaly, solid and well-maintained and built with attention to the things that matter in a house. The quality of the roof and the thickness of the walls and the placement of the hearth in relation to where people gathered in the evenings. It was the house of someone who understood that the point of a house is to be livable rather than impressive. Apollo knew it well. He had tended fires in it and eaten at its table, and listened to Admetus talk through the long evenings of the cold seasons. He knew which floorboard creaked near the door, and which corner of the kitchen stayed warmest on winter mornings, and how the light came through the east-facing window in a particular way in early spring that made everything it touched look briefly like something in a painting. He knew the house. He did not know, when he left it, that the house was going to ask something of him that he had not anticipated being asked. Several years after his exile ended, a piece of information came to Apollo through the channels. That pieces of information about mortal lives come through to gods who are paying attention. The Fates had set a date for Admetus. The Fates were 3 sisters, and their work was the most final work in the Greek universe. Clotho spun the thread of a life. Lachesis measured it. Atropos cutit. What they determined was determined, and the tradition of the Greek imagination was unanimous on this point, that the Fates were not overruled, almost not by gods. Apollo went to the Fates. He did not go with a threat or the kind of divine authority that could have been assembled if the situation had called for that approach. He went the way you go to someone you need something from when the power differential is not in your favor, which is to say carefully and with attention to what the other party actually valued. The Fates valued order. They valued the structure of the thing they maintained, the sense that the threads they managed ran their proper length and were cut at the right time, and that the whole system functioned with the integrity it had always functioned with. Apollo brought them wine. Specifically, he brought them very good wine at a time when they had been drinking, which the accounts mention with a specificity that suggests it was considered important to the outcome. The Fates, with wine in them, and a god at their table, who was being unusually pleasant about the whole thing, agreed to a modification. The modification was this: Admetus could live past the date they had set for him if, on that date, someone else died in his place. Willingly, the fates would accept that substitution. Apollo carried this back to Admetus. He told him what the arrangement was and what it required. Admetus went to his parents first. His parents were old. Both of them. Old in the way that people are old when they have lived a full life, and the world has the quality of something you have largely finished with, rather than something you are still moving through. He went to them and he told them what Apollo had arranged, and he asked if one of them would be willing to take his place on the day the fates had set. They said no. His father said it plainly, with the directness of a man who had not expected to be asked this question and had not enjoyed being asked it. He had his own life to finish. He was sorry about Admetus's situation, but his own life was his own. His mother said the same thing in different words. Admetus went to his friends, to the people who had stood with him in difficult times and called themselves loyal, and meant it in the way that loyalty is meant before it is tested by something that tests it fully. They said no, on by on, each of them with their own version of the same answer, which was that they valued him and they were sorry, and there was a limit to what they were able to offer. And the limit was here. Was this specific thing he was asking? He went home. Alcestis was waiting. She was his wife. She had been his wife for long enough that the shape of his life and the shape of hers had grown around each other in the way that long lives shared in close proximity grow around each other, where the absence of one would leave the other, structured around a space that nothing else would fit into. She had heard. She did not wait for him to ask. She told him she would go. Admetus looked at her across the room they had shared for all the years of their marriage, in the house that Apollo had tended fires in the ordinary northern Thessalian morning, with the light coming in from the east the way it always did. He said no. She said yes. What passed between them in that conversation, the accounts do not fully preserve, which is the right instinct, because some conversations belong to the people who have them. What the accounts preserve is the result, which was that Alcestis made her choice, and the choice held, and the day the fates had set for Admetus came. Admetus lived. Alcestis died. The house went quiet in the particular way that houses go quiet when the person who has been at the center of them is no longer there. When the presence that the rooms had arranged themselves around is gone, and the rooms have not yet figured out what to do about that. Apollo was not there. He had arranged the deal, and the deal had produced this result, and he was not there when the result arrived in the house. He was in the sky where he was supposed to be, where the work was, where the long view was available, and the daily crossing of the world from east to west required him. He understood from that distance what had happened. He understood the fact of it very clearly, what he could not understand, and would return to many times in the years that came after, was the why of it. Not why Alcestis had made the choice in the practical sense. The practical sense was simple enough. She loved Admetus. She did not want him to die. She had the ability to prevent his death, and she used it. But why that kind of love existed at all was something different. Apollo had loved people. He had loved Daphne and Hyacinthus and Coronis and others. Loved them with the full force of what he was capable of, which was considerable. He had not loved any of them the way Alcestis loved Admetus. The way Alcestis loved Admetus was not the love that arrived with force and demanded response. It was not the love that could be represented by an arrow. It was something that had grown slowly, in the particular way that things grow slowly in the same house over many years, unremarkable from day to day, adding to itself in increments too small to notice, until one day someone asks you what you are willing to give, and you find out the answer is everything. Apollo could not do that. He understood this about himself standing in the sky above the house in northern Thessaly, looking down at the place he had lived for 9 years, and swept floors in and tended fires in and eaten at the table of. He knew Admetus. He cared about Admetus. He had spent 9 years in that house and built something that he would have called friendship if he had been asked to name it. Something real and warm and built from actual time in actual rooms, doing actual things together, and he had not offered to take the place himself. The thought had crossed his mind, and it had crossed the distance between the thought and the action, and fallen somewhere in that distance, and had not arrived on the other side. He had gone to the fates instead. He had made a deal. Heracles arrived 3 days later. He came to the house without knowing what had happened, asking for hospitality, which Admetus gave him, because Admetus gave hospitality to people who came to his door even in the worst weeks of his life, because that was the kind of man he was. Heracles ate and drank, and then understood from someone in the household what had happened and what the house was in the middle of. He went down. Heracles, who was built for the kind of work that required being physically present in difficult places, went down to where Alcestis was, and he brought her back. He went, and he found death, and he held on to it until it gave up what it had taken, because that was the kind of solution Heracles arrived at when he looked at problems. Alcestis came back to the house. She stood in the doorway. Admetus looked at her from across the room. Apollo looked down at the house from the sky. He had arranged the deal that saved Admetus. Heracles had done the thing that actually brought the family back together. Apollo had negotiated, and Heracles had walked in person into the place where walking in person was what the situation required. There was something in that comparison worth sitting with. He sat with it. He did not reach a conclusion that resolved it cleanly. Some things do not resolve cleanly. Some things you think about for a long time, and what you arrive at is not an answer, but a better understanding of the question. He was the God of truth. He had always told the truth to everyone who came to him. The truth about himself was the one he kept almost reaching and not quite finding. Some kinds of love he could give, and some kinds he had never learned how to carry. And the not knowing sat in him in the particular way that the things you do not know about yourself sit in you, quietly and permanently, in the space, just behind the things you do know, present every time you reach past the known things for something further. He kept reaching. The house below held its light in the late afternoon, the way it always had. The river ran alongside it. The hills were the same hills, and somewhere inside, Admetus and Alcestis were in the same room again. Apollo turned the chariot east. Tomorrow he would start again from the beginning. He always did. The river in Phrygia runs red in certain seasons. The locals will tell you it is the minerals in the soil upstream, the iron-rich deposits in the hills that leach into the water when the spring rains come and color it, that particular shade that sits between rust and something darker. They are probably right about the minerals. The hills are there, and the iron is there, and the spring rains do what spring rains do. But the river has been that color for a very long time. And the story of why starts with a flute that nobody wanted. Athena made it first. She made it from the bones of a deer, carefully, and with the precision that Athena brought to everything she made, which was the precision of someone who understood the relationship between form and function at a level that most makers spend their lives approaching without fully reaching. The flute was good. It produced sounds that the air wanted to hold, that carried further than they should have, and arrived at the ear with a quality of clarity that ordinary instruments did not have. But when Athena played it, the other gods laughed. Not at the music. The music was extraordinary. They laughed at her face, at the way her cheeks filled with air, and her expression changed from the composed and formidable thing it usually was into something that struck them, in the particular way that divine communities find things funny, as undignified. Athena looked at her reflection in a pool while she was playing, and she saw what they saw. She threw the flute away. She cursed it first. She said that whoever picked it up and played it would pay a price for the playing. Then she threw it into the world and walked away from it, and went back to being the goddess of wisdom and craft and warfare. Her face arranged the way she preferred to arrange it. The flute landed in Phrygia. Marsyas found it. Marsyas was a satyr. which in the Greek imagination means he was part of the wild world, the untamed part, the part that exists outside the boundaries of cities and temples and the formal structures that human beings and gods alike build to keep the chaos at a manageable distance. He had the legs of a goat, and he lived in the forests and fields of Phrygia without the overlay of civilization that most of the beings in this story carried. He picked up the flute. He played it, and what came out of it was extraordinary. Not extraordinary in the way that Apollo's music was extraordinary, which was the way that perfect things are extraordinary, with the beauty of something that could not be other than what it is. What came out of Marsyas's flute was extraordinary in a different way. It was warm and strange and not quite controlled. The way living things are not quite controlled. The way a river follows its own logic toward its own destination with a force that was entirely its own. It was the most alive music anyone in Phrygia had ever heard. Word spread, the way word spreads when something genuinely remarkable is happening. Not through formal announcement, but through the simple mechanism of people telling other people. People came from the villages and the farms and the hills to hear Marsyas play, and they listened with the specific quality of attention that people give to things touching. Something in them they did not know was there to be touched. Marsyas listened to himself play, and he heard what they heard. And he made the mistake. It was not a complicated mistake. It was the mistake that people make when they are genuinely good at something and have been told by enough people that they are genuinely good at it and have started to let the space between genuinely good and the best that has ever existed close up in their own minds until it seems smaller than it actually is. He said he was as good as Apollo. He may have said he was better. The exact wording varies across the accounts, which is usually a sign that the exact wording matters less than the basic act. And the basic act was Marsyas putting his music alongside Apollo's music and suggesting that the comparison was reasonable. Apollo heard. Apollo always heard. The challenge was arranged, the way these things were arranged in the Greek world, with the muses as judges and the terms agreed in advance. Each would play. The muses would decide. The winner could do whatever he wanted with the loser. That last part is the part worth paying attention to. They played. Marsyas played first. He played the way he always played, with the warmth and the wildness and the quality of something alive and not fully tamed. And the sound went out into the Phrygian air, and the trees held it for a moment after it stopped, the way trees sometimes hold sounds. And the muses listened with the full attention that the muses brought to music, which was the most complete attention available in the Greek world on the subject of music. Then Apollo played. He played the lyre, the one Hermes had traded him for the cattle all those years ago in the meadow at Pieria. And what came from it was what had always come from it when Apollo played, which was the music of absolute clarity, the music of things that are fully themselves, fully realized, fully present in the form they were always going to take. It was not warm the way Marsyas's music was warm. It was something colder and more permanent. The way light is colder and more permanent than the warmth it carries. The muses conferred. They gave the judgment to Apollo. What happened next is the part of the story that the retellings handle differently depending on what they are trying to say. Some versions are brief about it. Some are detailed in ways that serve no purpose beyond the detail itself. What all the versions agree on is the fact of it, which was that Apollo exercised the terms of the agreement, and the terms of the agreement were absolute, and the cost to Marsyas was everything his body could give. The river ran the color. It has run since. Now, there is a way to tell this story that makes it simple. Apollo was the better musician. The contest had terms. The terms were honored. The moral, if you want one, is do not challenge gods. That version is not wrong, but it leaves out the part that makes this story worth telling, which is the part that happens inside the story rather than on the surface of it. Apollo was the better musician in a specific way. He was more precise. His music was more perfectly formed and more fully realized, and more completely itself than anything Marsyas could produce. If the question was, which music was more perfect, there was no real contest, and the muses knew it, and their judgment reflected it. But Marsyas was playing something that Apollo's music did not play. He was playing the part of music that comes from not being perfect, the part that comes from a satyr in a field in Phrygia with a found flute and no formal training and a feeling in his chest that needed to go somewhere and found the flute as the way out. The part that does not know what it is going to do before it does it and discovers itself in the doing. That part was real. It was not as perfect as what Apollo played. It was real in a way that Apollo's music, which was perfect, sometimes was not. Apollo heard that. He was the god of music, and he heard everything there was to hear in what Marsyas played, and he heard that part of it, and he understood what it was. He won anyway. He honored the terms anyway. He exercised his rights under the terms anyway. And when it was over, he stood beside the river in Phrygia, and the sound of what had just happened was still in the air, and he did not feel what victory usually felt like. He had won competitions before. He had been on the winning side of things enough times to know the particular quality of that feeling, the clean resolution of something that had been uncertain, becoming certain in your favor. This did not feel like that. It felt like something else. He turned the feeling over and looked at it from the different angles that precision requires, and he found the word eventually. The word was wrong. Not wrong in the sense of incorrect. Not wrong in the sense of a mistake that could be corrected by doing something differently. Wrong in the deeper sense. The sense in which something can be entirely within the rules and still be wrong in the way that the rules were insufficient to capture. He had won. He had been right to win. By every measure available to the situation. The river was the color it was going to be from now on. And in the silence after, in the Phrygian afternoon with the hills above and the red water below, he heard the echo of the flute music that was gone now, the warm, living sound of something that could not be reassembled, and he understood that he had not just won a contest. He had ended something that could not be replaced by what had beaten it. That was a different kind of winning than the kind he was used to. He had always been able to turn the things he lost into something. Daphne into the laurel, Hyacinthus into the flower. The losses had their memorials. He could not turn this into anything. This was a victory. You cannot memorialize a victory, but you can carry the sound of a flute in a Phrygian field long after the field has gone quiet. He carried it. He walked away from the river, and the sound walked with him. Some victories stay with you longer than the defeats. He had not known that before Phrygia. He knew it now, and the river ran the color it had run since, carrying the iron from the hills, down through the valley, and out toward the sea. Red in the spring and rust in the summer, and dark at the edges, when the light was going out of the sky and the color looked. If you were standing at the right place on the bank, at the right hour, almost like something that was not minerals at all, almost. The city of Thebes was quiet in the way that only cities can be quiet, that have lost something so large, the loss has not yet finished arriving. It was the kind of quiet that settles into stone, into the walls of houses and the paving of streets and the steps of temples. The kind of quiet that stone holds after the sounds that made it go quiet have stopped. Holds it the way stone holds heat, slowly releasing what it has absorbed over the long hours after the source of it is gone. Thebes had been loud not long before. Niobe had made sure of that. She was a queen in the way that certain queens are queens, not because the role had been handed to her by circumstance, but because she had the quality that makes a role feel inevitable. The quality of presence that fills a room to its edges and makes the room feel like it was always designed to hold exactly this person. She was the daughter of Tantalus. She was the wife of Amphion, king of Thebes, the man who had built the city walls by playing music so beautiful that the stones moved themselves into position. She had 7 sons and 7 daughters, 14 children. She counted them, not obsessively, not the way a person counts things when they are frightened of losing them. She counted them the way you count the things you are most proud of, with the pleasure of a number that keeps proving itself large enough to justify the pride. 14 children, the most beautiful children in Thebes. They moved through the city like proof of something, like evidence of a life that had gone exactly the way a life is supposed to go when everything works. The festival of Leto was being observed in the city. The women of Thebes were moving through the streets with their offerings, with the laurel branches and the incense and the small formal devotions that the calendar required, honoring the mother of Apollo and Artemis. Niobe came out of her palace. She looked at the procession. She said what she said. The accounts preserve it with reasonable consistency, which suggests the specific words were understood to matter. She said that Leto had 2 children. She had 14. She said that Leto was honored with festivals while she, who had produced 7 times the number of children that Leto had managed, received the ordinary respect of a queen and nothing more. She said, in the direct language of someone who had thought about this and arrived at a conclusion, that if one of them deserved divine honors, it was not the mother of 2. She told the women of Thebes to stop. She told them to put down the laurel branches and the incense and to redirect whatever devotion they had been planning to offer. The women of Thebes looked at her. Some of them put down their offerings. High on Olympus, Leto heard. Apollo and Artemis heard. What happened next came quickly. That is the part the accounts agree on most firmly. The speed of it, not the drawn-out quality of a punishment designed to make a point, with time built in for the recipient to understand what is happening and why. What came from Olympus came at the pace that divine response comes when the thing that has been said is the kind of thing that does not wait for consideration. Apollo took the sons. Artemis took the daughters. They came with their bows the way they always came when they came this way, from a distance, with the precision that was their shared inheritance from their shared origin. What the arrows did, they did quickly. The city went quiet. Niobe was in the square when it happened. She saw it happen. She stood in the square of Thebes, and she watched the thing she had counted and been proud of and built her certainty around become the thing that was gone. One, and then another, and then another. And the number that had been 14 became 13 and 12 and 11, and the counting went the wrong way and did not stop until it reached a number that was not a number anymore. 0. She stood in the square. The city was quiet. She had made the city quiet, and the quiet was not the quiet she had intended to make. The accounts say that she turned to stone herself. Not immediately. Not in the same instant that the last of her children was gone. She stood there for some time in the square. And then the process began in the way that the processes of transformation begin in mythology. At the edges, at the parts of a person that are already closest to the thing they are becoming. Stone, starting at the feet, moving upward through a body that had stood in a palace and looked out over a city and counted 14 children and found the number sufficient reason for any claim she wanted to make. Moving upward until she was entirely what the grief had made her. But she kept weeping. That is the part that stays. The weeping that continued after the transformation. The water running from stone eyes down stone cheeks, falling onto a stone chest, falling onto the ground that had witnessed the thing that had made it necessary. A rock on a mountainside in Lydia, which is where the stone eventually came to rest. Still weeps. The water comes out of the rock and runs down the face of it and collects at the base and joins whatever other water is moving through that part of the world. It is still there. People still go to see it. Now, this is the story that requires the most care of any story in Apollo's account, because it is the easiest to read as a simple moral, and the reading is not sufficient to what the story actually is. The simple reading is this. Niobe was arrogant. She said things she should not have said. She was punished. The moral is, Do not compare yourself to gods. That reading is not enough. Niobe was a mother, whatever else she was. Whatever the pride and the error and the specific words she said in the square of Thebes on the morning of the festival. She was a mother of 14 children who had made herself vulnerable to this particular catastrophe by loving those 14 children enough to count them and build her sense of herself around the counting. The pride was real. The love was also real. And what happened in the square of Thebes did not distinguish between them. Could not distinguish between them. Because they were not separable in the way that Niobe was made. The love and the pride were the same root, producing two different flowers. And what came from Olympus cut the root. Apollo was defending Leto, his mother who had walked across the water in the dark, his mother who had held the small palm tree on the floating island and asked nothing from the world except one place to stand, his mother who had been turned away from every shore and kept walking anyway. He was defending her. That was real too. The defense was real, and the cost of the defense was 14 children, and a mother turned to stone with the water still running out of her, because the grief was too large to stop when the body that was grieving had been converted into something that no longer had the mechanism for stopping. There is a moment in certain stories where you look for the person who was wrong, so you can put the weight of the story down on them and walk away lighter. This story does not give you that person cleanly. It gives you Niobe, who was proud and who loved her children and who said the wrong thing to the wrong audience on the wrong morning. It gives you Apollo, who loved his mother and defended her with the thing he was best at, the bow. From the distance he always maintained. It gives you 14 absences and a city, quiet in the way that cities are quiet when the stone has absorbed everything the stone can absorb. And it gives you water running out of rock on a mountainside in Lydia. Still running, because some griefs do not have a bottom. They simply find new forms to keep running in. And the stone weeps, and the city was quiet. And Apollo flew back across the sky. That was always his sky. In the chariot. That was always his chariot, carrying the light that the world below had always needed from him. Carrying other things too. Things that did not have names as clean as light. Things that he carried the way you carry what you cannot put down. Forward. Always forward. Because the sun does not stop. And he was the sun. And the sun does not get to stop. The beach at Troy was loud before it went quiet. That is the nature of beaches where armies camp. The sound of 10,000 men doing the ordinary things that 10,000 men do when they have been somewhere for a long time. Cooking and arguing and sharpening weapons and sleeping badly and waking up and doing it again produces a particular quality of noise that is not quite like any other sound in the world. It is the sound of human beings in proximity to each other under conditions that are not comfortable. And it carries underneath the ordinary sounds of daily life a low, persistent tension. The way a river carries silt, invisible but present in everything. The army had been at Troy for 9 years. 9 years on that beach. The walls of the city were visible from the camp, close enough to see the guards moving along the top of them in the early morning, far enough that the distance between the beach and the walls had become its own kind of country. A no-man's land that both sides crossed to fight in and neither side controlled. 9 years of crossing that ground and going back to where they had come from with the walls still standing. The Greeks were tired. They were not ready to admit they were tired. Because armies that have been somewhere for 9 years and have not won have invested too much to be willing to admit that what they have invested has not produced what they came for. But the tiredness was there in the way tiredness is there, when it has been present long enough to stop feeling like tiredness and start feeling like the normal condition of things. They were not paying attention to an old man. That was the beginning of it. Chryses was his name. He was a priest of Apollo, which in the Greek world meant something specific. It meant he had dedicated his life to the service of the god, to the maintenance of Apollo's temple, and the conduct of Apollo's rites, and the tending of the relationship between the god and the people who lived in that god's territory. It was not a casual role. It was a life organized entirely around a specific set of obligations and a specific set of protections that came with meeting those obligations. One of those protections was this: when a priest of Apollo came to you in his formal capacity, wearing the sacred ribbons and carrying the staff that marked him as what he was, you received him with the respect that his position required, not because the man himself necessarily warranted exceptional treatment, because the god he represented did. Chryses came to the Greek camp wearing the sacred ribbons and carrying the staff of Apollo. He had gold with him, a substantial ransom, the kind that communicated that the person offering it was serious and that the thing being ransomed was worth being serious about. He had walked through the Greek camp with this ransom, and he had come to Agamemnon, the commander, the king of kings, the man nominally in charge of putting 10,000 Greeks back on their ships with something to show for 9 years on a beach. His daughter was in the camp, Chrysis. She was called, named for her father. She had been taken in a raid on a coastal settlement, and she was in Agamemnon's possession in the specific and unpleasant way that the ancient world allowed for women taken in raids. Chrysis asked for her back. He showed the ransom. He spoke the formal words that a priest of Apollo speaks when asking for something in his official capacity, the words that carried the weight of the god's authority behind the human voice using them. He asked politely. He asked with the dignity of a man who knows what he is owed and is asking for it correctly. Agamemnon said no. He did not say no quietly or privately or with any of the diplomatic management that the situation technically required. He said no loudly and in front of people, and with the specific contemptuous directness of a man who has been in command of 10,000 other men for 9 years and has stopped being careful about the smaller signals he sends through the way he treats people. He told the old man to go away. He said the ribbons and the staff meant nothing to him. He said Chrysis was staying. He told the old man to leave before he stopped being generous about it. Chrysis left. He walked back through the camp the way he had come, past the fires and the tents and the men doing the ordinary things that men in camps do. And nobody said anything different from what Agamemnon had said, and the sea was on his left, going out, and the walls of Troy were somewhere ahead in the distance. He walked to the edge of the water. He stopped there where the waves came in and went back. He prayed. He prayed to Apollo the way a man prays who has spent his life in genuine service of a god and knows that the relationship between them is not casual, who understands that what he is asking is being asked within a context of real obligation on both sides. He told Apollo what had happened. He told Apollo what had been said and how it had been said, and what the man who had said it had told him about the sacred ribbons and the staff. He asked Apollo to make it right. Apollo heard. From wherever Apollo was in that moment, he heard the prayer of his priest on the beach at Troy, and he heard what was in it, the specific combination of injury and correct procedure that constituted a legitimate claim. He came down from Olympus. The accounts say he came in anger, which is accurate, but anger in the way that a precise and powerful thing is angry. Not the hot, chaotic anger that produces wild and disproportionate responses, but the cold and specific anger of something that has been given a clear grievance and is responding to it with appropriate force. He had his bow. He had his quiver of silver arrows. He sat on a ridge above the Greek camp. The first arrow went into the mules, then the dogs, then the men. The plague that followed was the kind of plague that ancient armies, packed together on beaches with poor sanitation and shared water sources, and the accumulated physical stress of 9 years of inadequate food and inadequate rest and inadequate everything, were genuinely vulnerable to. Apollo did not need to work against the laws of the world to make this happen. He worked with them, which is the particular efficiency of a god who understands how things work well enough to use the way they work as his instrument. The fires burned for 9 days, not the fires of cooking and warmth and the ordinary maintenance of camp life, the fires of the dead, pyres on the beach, one after another, the smoke going up into the Trojan sky and drifting out over the water and the sound of it, the crackling and the silence around the crackling, becoming the defining sound of the camp, where the defining sound had previously been the noise of 10,000 men doing the things they did. 9 days. The Greeks began to understand that something was being said to them. Achilles called an assembly. He was not the commander. Agamemnon was the commander. But Achilles was what Achilles had always been, which was the most completely realized warrior in the Greek world, the person in whom the ideals of the culture were most fully present, and that gave him a kind of authority that was different from the authority of command, and in some ways larger. He said they needed to find out why. He said they should ask the seer. Calchas, the seer, knew why. He had always known why. But knowing and saying were different things. When saying required telling Agamemnon something Agamemnon did not want to hear in front of the assembled army. He asked Achilles for protection first. Achilles gave it. Calchas told them what Apollo's priest had asked, and what Agamemnon had said, and what the arrows on the beach were the response to. Agamemnon was not pleased to hear this. He was not pleased in the loud and specific way that he had been not pleased with the priest, which did not suggest that 9 days of pyres on the beach had fundamentally changed his approach to situations in which he was required to give up something he had decided was his. He gave back Chrysis. He took Briseis from Achilles instead, to replace what he had given up. Because that is the kind of solution that a man arrives at when the problem he is solving is the problem of his own pride, rather than the problem actually in front of him. Ashur went to his tent. The war changed. Here is what is worth understanding about this moment, about these 9 days and this old man on the beach, and this particular sequence of events. The Iliad is one of the oldest and greatest stories that Western civilization has. It begins not with a battle. It begins not with Achilles, though Achilles is what most people remember about it. It begins with a priest and a god and a commander who could not bring himself to say yes to a simple and legitimate request. Before the duel of Hector and Ajax, before the wounding of the gods on the battlefield, before the death of Patroclus and the grief of Achilles and the dragging of Hector's body around the walls and the old king coming in the night to ask for his son back, before all of it, the great poem that begins the Western literary tradition begins with an old man walking to the edge of the water and praying, and being heard, the God of truth and light and music and healing and prophecy, the God who had been born on a floating island to a mother who could not find a place to rest, the God who had built Delphi on the body of what he had killed, and played the lyre for the first time in a meadow in Pieria, and stood at the edge of a riverbank with his hands on bark that was going cold. That God sat on a ridge above the Greek camp with a bow and silver arrows, and he answered the prayer of the man who had called to him from the water's edge. He answered because the priest had done everything right. He answered because when someone who has given their life to your service calls to you from the water's edge and tells you what was said to them, the God of truth has a very clear sense of what the situation requires. The arrows went out. The fires burned. 9 days. And when it was over and Agamemnon had finally, under the pressure of events, done the thing that should have taken him about 30 seconds to do the first time, the war settled back into what it had been before, and Achilles went to his tent with his anger, and the Greeks went back to looking at the walls that were still standing. But something had shifted. The war had a shape now that it had not had before, a direction that the 9 days of plague had bent it into, and it would follow that direction to the end that it had always been going to reach. Troy was still beautiful. The walls were still standing. The guards still moved along the top of them in the early morning, in the particular way that guards move when they are cold and tired, and have been doing the same thing for 9 years, and are trying to decide if they believe any more in what they are guarding. The war was not over. It was, in certain ways, only just beginning, and the God of light was already in it, already on the ridge, already watching. with the bow that did not miss, and the arrows that went where they were sent, and the long, clear view of everything that was happening and everything that was going to happen next. He had always known how this was going to go. He went into it anyway, because an old man had prayed from the water's edge. And some things you answer because you have been asked correctly, and some things you answer because not answering would make you something other than what you are. The walls of Troy were built by gods. That is not a metaphor. In the accounts that the Greeks preserved about the history of the city, the walls were built by Poseidon and Apollo, the two gods who had at some point in the deep past been required to serve a mortal king, and who had put the stone in place with the attention to structure that gods bring when they are applying themselves to physical construction. Apollo had built those walls. He knew exactly what they could withstand. He knew the composition of the stone and the quality of the mortar, and the points where the engineering was strongest and the points where it was less strong. He had been present when the foundation was laid, and when the gates were hung, and when the towers were finished, and the city inside the walls began to become the city that everyone who saw it understood immediately was built to last. He knew the walls, and he knew they were going to fall. Cassandra had told him, or rather he already knew what Cassandra knew, because the knowledge of Troy's ending was not something that required the gift of prophecy to access. If you were the god of prophecy and you were paying attention to how the war was going, he knew Troy would fall. He knew it with the same clarity. He knew everything, with the particular weight of actual knowledge, rather than the uncertain estimation of someone making a reasonable guess. He chose Troy anyway. That choice requires examination because it is not obvious. He was Greek in the sense that mattered to the Greek religious world. He was the god of Delphi and the god of the games at Delos, and the god whose temple sat at the center of Greek religious life. The god that Greek civilization had organized itself around in 100 different ways across the centuries of that civilization's existence. The Greeks on the beach were his people in every meaningful sense of that word. He chose the Trojans. He stood behind the walls he had built, and he put the weight of his presence on the side of the city he knew was going to lose. Part of it was what had happened on the beach with Chryses. The debt from the beginning of the war was not discharged when Agamemnon returned Chryses. A debt of that kind, incurred by a public humiliation in front of 10,000 men, is not cleared by the minimum required action taken under the pressure of 9 days of plague. It sits. It changes the quality of how you see the people who incurred it. Part of it was Hector. Hector was Priam's oldest son and the defender of Troy, and he was, in the specific way that the Iliad presents him, the most fully human figure in the poem. Not the most powerful. Achilles was more powerful. Not the most clever. Odysseus was more clever. But Hector was the one who understood what he was fighting for with the complete and lived clarity of someone who walks through the thing he is defending every morning, who knows the streets and the people in them, and the faces of his children, and the weight of the responsibility to keep those things intact. He was a man who loved his city. Apollo understood that. He had always been the god of cities, of the ordered and beautiful and constructed things that human beings build when they decide to make a permanent mark on the world. Delphi was his city in the sense that mattered most. The sacred city, the one built specifically in his honor. But he understood all cities. He understood what it meant to build something and maintain it, and stand inside it, and feel the walls around you as evidence of human intention made permanent in stone. Hector felt that every day. Apollo could not stand against that. He did what he could from the side of the walls. He moved through the battle the way gods move through battles in the Iliad. Not as a fighter, exactly, but as a force that altered the conditions under which fighting happened, that pushed the probabilities in the direction of the outcome he preferred. He kept Hector alive as long as he could. He deflected the Greek arrows that would have ended Hector's part in the war too soon. He could not keep him alive past what the fates had determined. Achilles came back. Achilles had been in his tent, famously, with the anger that Agamemnon had put in him, and that he had not yet found a reason large enough to set down. The reason came in the form of Patroclus. his closest companion, who had gone into the battle wearing Achilles' armor and had been killed by Hector, and whose death converted Achilles' anger from the cold, manageable thing it had been in the tent into something that moved through the Greek camp like the plague had moved through it, with a single direction and nothing capable of stopping it. He came back for Hector. Apollo watched from the walls he had built. He had kept Hector alive long enough. He had done what could be done within the structure of what was going to happen. What was going to happen was going to happen, because that is what the fates had determined, and the fates were the one thing in the Greek universe that did not negotiate, that did not respond to wine or good manners or the genuine love of a god who had spent years inside those walls and knew every face in them. Hector died outside the walls of Troy. The city held for a little while after that, long enough for the Greeks to remember that the walls were built by gods and that direct assault was not going to be the mechanism of the ending. Long enough for someone to think of the horse. The horse. Apollo watched them build it on the beach. He watched the Greeks fill it with the soldiers who were going to end the city, and he watched them leave it outside the walls, and he watched the Trojans find it in the morning, and he watched them argue about what it was and what to do with it, and he heard Cassandra say what it was and what to do with it, and he watched the Trojans not listen to her and bring it through the gates. He watched all of that. He had made sure Cassandra would not be believed. He stood on the walls he had built and watched the horse come through the gates of the city he had chosen to stand behind, and he understood in that moment, with the full force of everything, he was built to understand that he had done both of those things, and that both of those things were true at the same time. He had chosen Troy. He had ensured that the one person in Troy who could have saved it would not be heard. Both of those things were him. Both of those things were part of the same existence, the same God, the same long history of doing what the moment seemed to require and living afterward with the full understanding of what the thing had been. The fires started in the night. He had seen fires before. He had seen the fires on the beach during the 9 days of plague, the funeral fires that had signaled the cost of one man's pride. He had seen fires across the centuries of watching the world from the Chariot, the ordinary fires and the extraordinary ones. These fires were different. These were the fires of the city he had built the walls of, burning in the night on the plain of Anatolia, the smoke going up into the sky. He drove across every morning, visible from the Chariot the next day, as a column of dark rising from the place where something built to last was finding out what lasting actually meant. He did not look away. That was the one thing. He had made his choices, and he had lived inside those choices through the whole length of the war, and he was not going to manage the ending by looking somewhere else while it happened. He looked at Troy burning the way you look at the things you chose, with the full and unobstructed attention of someone who understands that looking away is not an option that honesty allows. Troy burned. The walls came down. Cassandra was right about all of it. She was always right. And somewhere in the long aftermath of the burning, in the silence that followed the fire, the way silence always follows fire when the fire has been large enough, a question settled into the air over the plain of Troy and stayed there, whether choosing a losing side. When the side you choose is the beautiful and human and doomed one, is the wrong choice. Apollo had known Troy would fall. He had stood behind its walls anyway, not because he did not understand the outcome. He understood the outcome the way he understood everything, with a clarity that left no room for the comfortable ambiguity that makes some choices easier to make. He understood, and he chose the city. He chose the streets Hector walked through in the mornings. He chose the walls he had built with his own hands in a time before the war, when the stones were new and the mortar was setting, and the city inside was just beginning to understand what it was going to become. He chose the walls, and they fell, and he was there when they fell. Some choices are not about winning. They are about which side of a beautiful and terrible thing you want to be standing on when it comes down. He had been standing on that side. He was still standing there in the smoke and the silence, still there. The smoke cleared slowly. That is the nature of smoke from a large fire. It does not disperse the way smaller things disperse, cleanly and quickly, and without leaving evidence of itself in the air. It spreads. It moves with the wind, in the direction the wind is moving, and it carries the smell of what was burning with it. And the smell arrives in places far from the fire, in villages and on ships, and in the camps of people who were not there. And it tells them something happened before any human messenger arrives to explain what. The smoke from Troy reached a long way. It reached the islands of the Aegean and the coasts of Asia Minor and the harbors where the Greek ships had come from. And the people in those places lifted their heads and smelled it and knew, in the way that human beings know things before they know them formally, that something large was over. The war was over. Troy was over. Apollo turned the chariot east the next morning, the way he turned it east every morning, and the light came down on the plain of Anatolia and found the ruins of the city, the way light finds everything, without preference and without judgment, falling equally on the stones that were still standing and the stones that had fallen and the ground between them that held in the way. That ground holds what has happened on it. Quietly, and for a very long time, he drove across the sky above it. He kept going. That is the nature of the work. The light does not pause over particular places to mark them as significant. It does not linger above ruins and move quickly above places that are intact. It falls on everything at the pace the day requires, and it keeps moving because the day requires it to keep moving, and because that is what it has always done and what it will always do, regardless of what is below it on any given morning. He kept going. The years went on. Delphi kept receiving its pilgrims. The oracle on the mountain did not close because the war it had advised about was over. The questions kept coming the way questions always keep coming, because the supply of human uncertainty about the future is not a resource that gets depleted by events. Every generation produces its own uncertainty. Every generation arrives at the doors of the oracle with the same fundamental question, wearing different specific clothes. What is going to happen? The kings and generals who had gone to Delphi before Troy went to Delphi after Troy. Then their children went, and the children of those children. And the generations accumulated around the sanctuary the way sediment accumulates around a fixed point in a river, layer by layer, each one containing the evidence of the time it was deposited. Alexander came. He was the son of Philip of Macedon, and he arrived at Delphi in the 4th century, before the Common Era, with the particular quality of certainty that the extremely talented have when the certainty has not yet been tested fully enough, know its limits. He wanted to know if he would conquer the world. The Pythia did not want to give a formal consultation that day. Alexander came, anyway. He found her in the precincts, and he took her by the arm, and he walked her toward the inner chamber, and she said, in the exasperated tone of someone who has been interrupted in the middle of something else by a person who is not accustomed to being told to wait, "You are invincible, my boy." He took that as his answer. He went and conquered most of the world he knew about. He died in Babylon at 32 years old, with the conquering unfinished and no clear succession established, and the empire he had built beginning its long process of becoming the several smaller things it would eventually be. The oracle had said he was invincible. The oracle had not said for how long. The Romans came. They came to Greece the way large powers come to smaller ones that contain things they want. With a combination of military force and genuine admiration, that is one of the more complicated stances one civilization can take toward another. They took Greece. They also took Greek religion, Greek philosophy, Greek architecture, Greek art, and the Greek understanding of the gods. And they carried all of it back to Rome and installed it in a city that was in the process of becoming the largest thing the Western world had yet produced. They kept Apollo's name. That is the remarkable thing. In the Roman translation of the Greek divine world, almost every god received a new name. Zeus became Jupiter. Hera became Juno. Ares became Mars. Aphrodite became Venus. The names changed because the Romans were not simply borrowing the Greek gods. They were incorporating them into a Roman understanding of the world that had its own requirements and its own existing divine relationships. Apollo remained Apollo. The Romans looked at the god of light and music and prophecy and healing and truth, and they found in him something that corresponded so directly to something they already understood about the world that the name did not need to change. He was already what they needed him to be. Augustus Caesar built a temple to Apollo on the Palatine Hill, not near his house, on the hill itself, adjacent to his own residence, close enough that the god's dwelling and the emperor's dwelling shared the same ground. Augustus had a particular relationship with Apollo that he cultivated throughout his long reign, the understanding that the god of order and light and civilization was the appropriate divine sponsor for a man who had spent his life imposing order on a world that had been tearing itself apart. He said Apollo was his patron. He said it publicly and consistently, and backed the saying with the substantial resources of the most powerful empire in the Mediterranean world. Delphi received its pilgrims through the Roman period too. Then the consultations began to thin, not all at once, not the way a fire goes out when you stop feeding it, quickly and completely, more the way a tide goes out, gradually and unevenly, with the water still present in the low places long after it has retreated from the high ground. The world was changing in ways that were changing what questions people brought to high places on mountains, what they thought they could learn from the breath of the earth rising through a crack in the stone. The last formal consultation at Delphi happened in the 4th century of the Common Era. A late tradition remembered how it ended. The final message from the oracle, according to that tradition, said something close to this. Tell the king, the well-wrought hall has fallen. Apollo has no shelter, no prophetic laurel, no talking spring. The water of speech has dried up. That was the last thing the oracle said. If the tradition is right about it, the Pythia left the sanctuary. The fires went out. The laurel that had burned in the inner chamber since Apollo had built the temple on the body of Python, the laurel whose smoke had been present in the air above Delphi through every consultation and every king and every question about every war and succession and harvest and marriage and sea voyage. That laurel went out. The mountain was quiet. The crack in the earth kept breathing. The earth does not stop, because the things built on it do. The breath of the world kept rising through the stone of Parnassus in the cold mountain air. The way it had risen before Apollo came to the mountain, and the way it has risen since. The voice of the deep earth saying whatever it says in the language that has never been organized into something a human being can carry back down the mountain and use. The temple fell into the state that temples fall into when they are no longer actively tended. The slow, productive entropy of stone returning by degrees to the hillside it was quarried from. Grass grew in the cracks between the paving stones. The columns weathered. The inscription above the doorway remained readable for a long time, because stone letters cut deep resist weather better than most things. And know thyself was still legible to people who came and looked at the ruin in the centuries after the Pythia left. Know thyself. Still there. Still asking. The centuries kept moving. Apollo moved through them the way he moved through everything. Present in the system, rather than fixed to any particular location within it. He was in the Homeric poems that the Greeks recited and the Romans read, and the medieval scholars preserved in monasteries because the poems were too good to let disappear. He was in the theory of music that ran from the Greek understanding of harmony through the mathematical traditions of the medieval period and into the concert halls of the modern world, where the relationship between sound and structure that Apollo had embodied since Hermes traded him the lyre in the meadow at Pieria was still being explored and still producing things worth hearing. He was in the medical tradition. His son Asclepius had given his rod and his serpent to the symbol that healers still use. The rod of Asclepius, a single snake winding around a single staff. The image of healing that has been on the doors of hospitals and medical buildings across the world for long enough that most of the people who see it no longer know where it came from. But it came from Apollo. It came from the child pulled from the fire, from the healer trained by Chiron on the Thessalian hillside, from the man who went further than his father, in the direction his father had pointed, and was stopped by a thunderbolt, and became a symbol instead. The symbol endured. Symbols have a way of outlasting the specific stories they came from. They keep working after the story has been forgotten. The way a road keeps working after the people who built it are gone, carrying traffic that does not know what it is traveling on. Then there was the spaceship. In the year 1969 of the Common Era, a spacecraft left the surface of the Earth and traveled to the Moon. Think about what that means for a moment. A machine built by human beings, carrying human beings inside it, left the planet that human beings had lived on for the entirety of their existence and traveled through 238,000 miles of empty space to land on the surface of another world. The people who built it needed a name. They named it Apollo, not casually. The Apollo program was the largest scientific undertaking in human history up to that point. The thing that a nation had decided to pour its resources and intelligence and ambition into. The project that would define what that nation was capable of, and what the species was capable of, and what the future might look like if human beings kept reaching toward things they could not quite touch from where they were currently standing. They named it for the god of light, for the god of things that reach toward brightness across a very long distance. 3 men went to the Moon in a spacecraft named Apollo 11. 2 of them walked on the surface of it, and 1 of them waited in the orbiting module, and all 3 of them came back. The craft splashed down in the Pacific Ocean. The world watched, and the name Apollo moved out into the 20th century the way it had moved through every previous century. Present in something, attached to something, living in the thing it was attached to, the way all names live in the things they name, giving them a context that reaches further back than the thing itself can reach. A god of the ancient Greek world, born on a floating island in the Aegean Sea. A spacecraft crossing 238,000 miles of empty space to land on the Moon. The distance between those 2 things is very large, and it is not as large as it looks, because the thing that sent the spacecraft to the Moon was the same thing that sent Apollo up Parnassus and out across the Aegean and into the temples and through the centuries of questions and answers and music and healing and loss. The desire to go further, the desire to reach toward the light from wherever you are standing, the desire to find out what is up there and bring something of it back down. That desire did not start with Apollo. It will not end with a spacecraft named after him, but it ran through him, the way the breath of the earth runs through the crack in the stone at Parnassus, continuously and without stopping. From before the first story about him was told, to now, to this moment, to the particular hour in which someone is listening to these words in the dark before sleep. He was in the listening too. He was always in the listening. The light falls on everything. That is what it does. That is what it has always done. And the things it falls on, the stones and the rivers and the ruins of beautiful cities and the surfaces of other worlds. Hold the light for the moment it is on them, and then release it as the day moves on. As the chariot keeps moving, as the east keeps turning into west, and the west keeps becoming the east again, and the light keeps coming, new every morning, the same light it has always been. The horses are still, not the stillness of things that are resting, the stillness of things that have just finished something and know they are about to begin the same thing again. The particular quality of pause that exists between the ending of one crossing and the beginning of the next. The man holds the reins. He has held them every morning for longer than any human language has words to accurately describe. He will hold them tomorrow. He will hold them on the morning after that, and every morning that follows those mornings, until the world arrives at whatever ending it is moving toward. If it is moving toward an ending. If endings are the kind of thing the world moves toward. He does not know that. This is the part that surprises people when they learn it. He does not know how it ends. He knew how Troy would end and how the consultation at Delphi would end, and how the lives of the people he loved would end. The people and the gods and the cities that the long history of his existence had given him and taken from him in the way that long existences give and take. He knew those endings with the clarity of the god of prophecy, knowing things. He does not know the final one. He looks down at the world below him in the particular dark, before the first light comes over the eastern edge of things. He has looked at it this way every morning. It is different every morning, not different the way a painting is different when you look at it under different lighting, revealing details that were always there, but had not been visible before. Different in the more fundamental way that living things are different from one moment to the next because they are alive, and being alive is the condition of changing. The world changes. He watches it change. He watched the Greek cities build themselves up from the rocky ground of the Aegean coast and become the thing they became. The thing that produced the poetry and the philosophy and the temples and the democratic experiments and the wars and the art and the particular quality of attention to human experience that the Greeks had and that the world has been working with ever since. He watched Rome. He watched the long middle centuries, when the stories about him were carried in manuscripts through the cold, northern monasteries of Europe by monks who were not worshipping him and were in fact in the service of a different divine arrangement entirely, but who understood that the things in those manuscripts were too well made to lose, and who copied them anyway. By hand, in the candlelight, winter after winter, the words moving from old pages to new pages. Surviving, he watched the ships leave the European harbours going west into the ocean that the Greeks had called the Outer Sea, going to find what was there, which turned out to be more world than they had known existed, and he watched the new world take shape over the following centuries, the thing it was becoming on the other side of the water. He watched the spaceship. He watches still. Below him now, the world is asleep. Not all of it. The world is too large for all of it to be asleep at any one time. It is always morning somewhere, and always midnight somewhere, and always the middle of the afternoon somewhere. And the people in those different places are doing the different things that different times of day require. But the part of the world that is dark right now is mostly asleep. The breathing of it different from the breathing of the waking hours. Slower and deeper and more honest than the kind of breathing people do when they are conscious of being observed. He listens to it. He has always listened, as well as he has watched. The god of music does not stop hearing when the formal music stops. He hears the quality of the world's sound at every hour, the different notes it makes in different conditions, the sound of it at rest different from the sound of it at work, and both of those different from the sound it makes in the particular hours between midnight and dawn, when the human world is most fully given over to sleep, and the sounds it makes are the sounds of things doing what they do when they are not performing. He prefers this hour. He has never said that to anyone. It is the hour before the work begins, before he takes the chariot across the sky and gives the world below the light that it has organized itself around, since before there were cities or temples or questions brought to high places on mountains. The hour that belongs only to this, to the stillness of the horses and the dark below, and the particular quality of quiet that comes from knowing what is about to begin. He thinks about everything, not as a list, not as a review of what has passed the way you review a thing when you are trying to determine its value, more the way music thinks about everything when it is playing, holding many things simultaneously, each thing present in relation to the others, rather than isolated and evaluated on its own. He thinks about the island that stopped moving. He thinks about the small palm tree and the cold salt air and the way the morning had looked on that first morning. The first light, falling on the first ground, his feet had known. He thinks about the lyre, the particular note he played in the meadow when Hermes handed it to him. The first note, the one that went out into the Thessalian air and announced something that had not existed before that moment. He thinks about the laurel. He thinks about the bark under his hands that was still warm. He thinks about a purple flower in a Spartan field and a woman on the wall of a beautiful city saying something that nobody heard. He thinks about the river in Phrygia. He thinks about Admetus at the table in the evenings, talking about the quality of the northern pasture in different seasons, not knowing who he was talking to, just talking because the evening was good and there was someone there to talk to. He thinks about his son. He thinks about Troy. He thinks about the column of smoke rising in the morning air above the plain of Anatolia and the way he had not looked away from it. He thinks about the last words of the oracle, the way a late tradition remembered them. Tell the king, the well-wrought hall has fallen. He thinks about the spaceship. He thinks about 3 men crossing 238,000 miles of empty space in a machine that carried his name, going toward the light, the way human beings have always gone, toward the light, which is to say, at considerable personal risk and with no guarantee of arrival, and with the particular quality of faith that belongs to people who have decided that the going matters more than the certainty of getting there. He thinks about all of it without needing it to add up to something. He is old enough to know that things do not add up to something in the way that mathematics adds up to something, where you apply the correct operations and the answer comes out clean on the other side. The things that happen in a life, or in an existence that is longer than a life, do not have a correct operation that produces a clean answer. They have the weight they have and the shape they have, and the way they connect to each other is a web rather than a line, pulling in every direction at once. He holds the reins. The horses feel his hands settle. They know what that means. The dark is beginning to change at the eastern edge of things. It is the first change, the smallest one, the one you can only see if you know to look for it. The dark getting a fraction less dense in the east, the way water gets a fraction warmer near a heat source before you can actually feel the warmth. He knows this moment. He has known this moment every morning of his existence. He is still here. That is the thing. After everything, after the island and the palm tree, and the serpent on the mountain, and the city built on what the serpent left, after the girl who became a tree, and the boy who became a flower, after the truth given, and the truth made useless, after the woman who died in the fire he had started, and the son who was born from that fire, and the son taken by a thunderbolt for going too far in the direction his father had pointed, after 9 years on the ground in Thessaly learning the patience that the chariot had never taught him, after the woman who chose death for love and the god who could not understand why anyone would do that and could not stop thinking about it, after the contest in Phrygia and the river that ran red, after the mother turned to stone with the water still running out of her, after the plague arrows on the beach and the 9 days of fires and the walls he had built coming down in the night, after Troy, he is still here. He does not know if that means something. He knows that it is true. Every morning he takes the reins, not because the taking is easy, or because the crossing is without weight, or because the light he carries does not cost him anything to carry. He takes the reins because the morning is there, and the world is below him, waiting for the light, and because he is the thing that carries it, and some things you carry because they are yours to carry, and there is no version of the story in which you put them down. He is the God of light. He has always been the God of light. The dark below him is doing what it does in the moments before the light arrives, holding the sleeping world in the particular quality of dark that belongs to the end of the night, rather than its middle. The dark that already has the memory of morning in it, that is already beginning to move toward what it is about to become. He takes the reins. The horses lift their heads. The east gets lighter. He was the God of light and the God of truth and the God of music and the God of healing and the God of prophecy and the God of the long distance between what things are and what they could become. He could see the future. He could make the world stand still with a single note. He had loved and he had lost, and he had built beautiful things, and he had watched some of them fall, and he had turned the falling into flowers and laurels, and the names of stars, and the names of spaceships, and the names of the months of the year, and the names of the notes in the musical scale, and all the other ways that loss becomes the material of what comes next. He had done all of it, and he was still here, still carrying the light across the same sky he had always carried it across, still watching the world below with the full attention of something that has not stopped finding it worth watching. The chariot moves. The light begins. The sleeping world below him turns its face up toward the warmth, the way sleeping things turn toward warmth, without knowing they are doing it, without being awake enough to decide. And the morning comes. It always comes. That is the one thing about the morning that has never changed across all the mornings he has carried. It comes, and the world below is still there to receive it, and the light falls on it the way it has always fallen, on everything, without preference, without end.